I've been pretty fortunate to always have been able to work from home, even long before the whole COVID lockdown changed things so much. I've always been able to keep my own hours too, and this was helpful to me because I was a night person. I would often keep up all night long and go to sleep during the middle of the day. This really fit my personality. I'm already not much of a people person anyway. I mean, I like people well enough, don't get me wrong, but I'm really the sort of awkward person that just prefers to spend time by myself. Being like this, I often went out at night to get things too. There was this tiny convenience store a little ways outside my neighborhood that I liked to go to quite often. It was a bit of a liquor store, I guess, but they sold some things other than just alcohol. This took place during the winter time, and it was actually snowing pretty damn hard outside. I was wanting something to keep my energy up, so I decided to run down to the convenience store real quick and grab myself an energy drink. It was pretty late at night, but I can't recall exactly how late it was. Due to both the time and the falling snow, it was of course completely dead outside. I always liked hearing the sound of my own feet crunching in the new snow when I walked. There was just something relaxing about it. When I had left, I hadn't expected the snow to be falling quite as hard as it was now though. There was very little visibility outside. Fortunately, there was no one out driving, so I could walk out the side of the road without worrying about being run over or something. When I got to the store, I noticed someone standing outside smoking a cigarette. I gave them the same friendly wave that everyone in my town always gave to each other, which was returned in kind. Then I walked into the store. I got myself a Sobe Orange Tsunami, which was my drink of choice at the time. When I went to pay for it, I noticed there was a new worker behind the counter. I greeted him, made some polite chat about how I'd been coming to this store for years and how the owners were really nice. I told him I'd probably be seeing a lot more of him, since I shop there very often. The man seemed like a nice guy. When I turned to leave the store, the guy who was smoking was still there. As I got about a block away though, I turned around and noticed the man who had been smoking was now walking in my direction. I got that sort of nervous feeling I always get when I notice something strange like that. Remember, people already generally make me nervous, and that nervousness usually makes me assume someone is following me, even when they're most likely not. I turned off the road in town, into the subdivision that I lived in. When I'd gotten about a block into it, I once again felt compelled to turn around suddenly. I just wanted to check and see if the guy was still following me. Turned around, and there he was. My nervousness increased even more. I had a bit more to walk before I'd be able to get home. I started to go faster. I had 2 more streets to go down. I would check to see if he was following me down them as well. When I made the next turn, I checked, and yeah, he'd made the same turn too. I was thinking this was very much not a coincidence. I began to go even faster. I only checked back once in a while and tried to make it seem casual. He must have sped up too though, because he was continuously gaining on me. He kept pace with me and was slowly catching up to me. Finally, I turned down my own street, and the pattern repeated itself once again. My mind was going in many different directions. Why was he still lagging behind and not trying to catch up to me harder? When I got to my yard, I sort of trotted up the driveway and got into the house quickly. I went in and looked out the window. I could see him standing a little ways down the street. He'd stopped walking and looked like he was talking to someone on his mobile phone. I got an idea then. I had a dog at the time, a pit bull. I thought I would let the dog out in the front yard as a sort of warning, just in case this guy was planning on robbing my house or something. When I took the dog out, I could tell the man was obviously startled. He wasn't on his phone anymore and continued walking. He gave me a wave as he passed by and walked past my house down the street and turned off down another random street. The whole thing was extremely strange, and I didn't know what to think about it. I was happy that my dog ploy had scared the guy away though. The next day, I was watching the news, and I got the shock of my life. The liquor store I had visited had been robbed the following night. The owner had been beaten very badly and was found laying behind the counter. That made me wonder if perhaps the person I thought was a new cashier was actually a robber who was just pretending. I wondered if the owner, the old man I had known for quite a while, had just been laying behind the counter while I was there. Well, I contacted the police about my suspicions. They had someone picked up already and wanted to know if I could identify them. It was the cashier and the man who had followed me home. It turns out they had been in the middle of robbing the store and had just beaten up the owner when I happened to come walking in. It occurred to me that maybe he followed me home to make sure I hadn't seen what they were doing. I felt really bad for the kind old man who owned the store. I felt really appreciative of my dog Randy as well. If he hadn't scared that guy off, I might have been in pretty bad condition that night as well. I've had some pretty messed up experiences involving my family in the past. I guess it would be safe to say that there's a lot of dysfunction in my extended family. One night when I was visiting one of my aunt's houses, the worst of all these experiences happened. My mom had 2 sisters, you see, and their children and us, we sort of grew up like we were siblings instead of cousins. I was the second oldest cousin at the time. And when this particular story takes place, I was the oldest of the kids who were involved. My mom took me and my younger brother, and we drove out to my aunt's house. She lived a pretty decent drive out into the country in West Virginia. The thought was that we were going to spend a few days there. My other aunt lived pretty close to that area too, so when she found out we were going to visit, she decided to come along as well. At the time, I was about 14. My younger brother was 9. The other cousin at the house was the one that lived there, and he was about 12 back then. Apparently, all the adults wanted to go out to the bars. They bought us some frozen pizzas and rented us some movies to watch while they went out on the town. My mom wasn't much of a drinker, but she liked to go along for the fun with her family. None of the 3 parents were married at the time, but my Aunt Claire, not the one whose house we were going to, had this on and off again tumultuous relationship with a guy named Jack. I knew that she and Jack would often get drunk here and there and have these really outrageous fights. Fortunately, I'd never had to bear witness to any of them before. I really hated seeing adults fighting over stupid shit, so I was really glad about that. At this time, I wasn't really good at confrontation with others. So, they all go out. They were out for quite a while as well. The 2 younger kids went to bed earlier, and us 2 older kids stayed up to watch the scary movie the adults had rented for us. I was sort of at that vague age where a movie could still scare me, so I was a little bit scared while watching. What happened during the rest of the night would become much more memorable than that movie was. The phone began to ring, and my cousin, since he lived there, went and answered it. He told me it was my mom and that she needed to talk to me. On the phone with my mom, she told me that my Aunt Claire had left the bar for a short time, but told her sisters she would be coming back. Well, she had never returned. Jack, however, had called the bar, seeing if Claire was there. She then asked me if I'd seen or heard from Claire either, and I let her know I hadn't seen anything. The last thing she told me was that if Claire showed up at the house at any point, and if Jack showed up later, to not let him know she was there. I said okay, already dreading the possibilities of what would be coming. I went back to the living room, now filled with dread and apprehension at what might happen later in the night. It wasn't too long before Aunt Claire arrived at the house and knocked on the door. I went to let her in. She was extremely intoxicated and looked like she'd been in a fierce fight. I immediately thought Jack must have beat her up or something and got even more freaked out. She went down to lay in my aunt's room. She didn't want me to call the police or anything like that, so I didn't really know what to do. All I really could do was what I'd been told. I let her go to sleep and then went back to the movie. About 15 minutes later, I began to hear a fierce pounding on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I knew it had to be Jack. I wondered what I should do. I figured I had to at least answer the door because he knew that we were there. I went to the door and saw it was indeed Jack. He asked me if Claire was there. He seemed extremely angry. I was nervous. I did my best to keep my cool and told him I hadn't seen her all night. He asked if I had heard anything from my mom and aunt, and I told him no as well. I noticed in the light that his hand was wrapped up in a bandana. I immediately thought he must have heard it hitting her or something. He was a big guy, and I was scared he was going to force his way into the trailer and look around on his own. It looked like he was thinking about it too. Just then, though, thank God my aunt and mom arrived in their car. They told me to go into the house and close the door. I did what I was told, but I was still pretty scared of what might happen. It was only a few more moments when I heard a gunshot go off. That nearly made me piss myself. I was scared that Jack might have just shot my mom or aunt. Then, though, I heard my aunt yelling at him to get lost, or her next shot would not be a warning shot. After a few moments, my mom and aunt rushed into the house. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that my aunt kept a rifle in her car. It was the sort of thing my family did, after all. I was, however, a bit worried when they took my other aunt to the hospital. They told me to keep the doors locked and use the gun in case Jack came back. I'd shot a gun a few times, and I was not really a fan. I spent quite a while looking out the windows, fearful Jack would return, but thankfully he never came back, and I did not have to use the gun that night. For the past year, I've encountered a buttload of crazy people, and have accumulated even more crazy stories. While most of them would make you laugh your butt off, the one I've chosen to share was terrifying while it was happening, and still gives me shivers whenever I think about it. A little more than a year ago, I applied for and got a job at my favorite convenience store, right across the street from my home. I'd moved there my sophomore year in college, and decided to stay after I left school. This little store had almost served as a sort of savior for me. Living as young men often do, I had very little money, but I was always confident I could find something to fill my belly, regardless of how much was in my pocket at the time. When the time came that I was no longer able to rely on my parents for money, the corner store was the first place I went to look for a job. Turned out I was in luck. Only the day before, one of the employees had been fired for stealing from the register. I took his place, and I've been working here ever since. Like any other corner store, we sell loads of alcohol. Beer, wine, liquor, the whole boat really. Naturally, this makes us a beacon for the local drunks. These folks have served as countless hours of entertainment. While most are harmless people, on one specific occasion, a horribly violent outburst occurred. It was a quiet Saturday night, about an hour before close. Most of the regulars had already made their appearances, a few more than once even. The two involved in this incident had been in around 7 p.m. and just returned. They were, or at least appeared to be, a couple. I'd seen them around the neighborhood occasionally since I'd moved in. The owner of the store said they'd been customers ever since he'd bought it, and that was 13 years ago. Although they were not very talkative when they came in, I never had any reason to suspect either could become violent. That night, something changed, though. Upon arriving the second time, they went straight to the cooler containing the quart and 40-ounce size beers. Nothing too out of the ordinary. All of a sudden, though, an argument began between the two soon after they arrived. Initially, I couldn't hear what it was about, but soon I began to hear everything they were screaming across the store. I minded my own business for a while, but once the woman began screaming curse words at the man, I felt I had to at least get them to take it outside instead. I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do, but I began my walk to the opposite side of the small store. Before I was even halfway there, the man began to scream back at the woman. I'm not sure exactly what she said to him, but it had obviously infuriated him quite a lot. Mere moments before, he had grabbed a bottle of Busch or some other cheap beer from the cooler. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he began to strike at the woman's head with it. I'm not sure if he thought it would just break, or if he intended on killing her with the nearest thing he could, but strike after strike, he continued. It was a horrifying thing to witness. I blame the entertainment industry for giving people a false impression of how easy it is to break a beer bottle over someone's head. I assure you, it's very hard. Following the 5th or 6th strike, the woman had dropped completely to the floor and stopped moving altogether. The man stood over her with the blood-soaked bottle for a moment. He looked up, when I assume he heard me sprinting towards them. The second he saw me, he ran out the side door and disappeared into the darkness. The sight of the woman laying there made me sick to my stomach. Blood was dripping from her ears, but the most shocking thing was the growing pool around her head. It seemed like a bad idea to touch her myself, so I made the decision to call the paramedics and let them check her for a pulse. When they arrived, she was still alive, but they didn't have much hope for her survival. The cops certainly didn't seem in any hurry to get there, but when they did arrive 45 minutes later, I did my best to fill them in on all I'd seen. From the way they reacted, I got a strong feeling they were very familiar with these two. While on shift a few days later, my boss came in with some unfortunate news. The female was brain dead. Her family had made the choice to let her pass away. Unfortunately, it was now a murder. The cops had picked the guy up the following night. From the description my boss gave me, he didn't even seem to remember what had happened. The doctors that had examined him said it's likely he truly may not even remember what he'd done. The many years of alcohol abuse had destroyed his brain. Sounds like he might not even get the full punishment due him under the law. I'm not really sure how to feel about that, honestly. Sometimes it seems like people really do get away with murder. I serve as one of 2 managers for a local branch of a national convenience store chain, starting as a wide-eyed 23-year-old girl. I worked my way up to night manager within 5 years. Not exactly a groundbreaking achievement, I admit, but still an achievement nonetheless. My job includes staying late after closing to count the night's drawers and drop the deposits for the day manager to put in the bank. I've never minded much having to do this job. The past 5 years working here has been on the night shift, and nothing really scary has ever happened while I was on the clock. The only holdup in the history of the store occurred during the daytime. Therefore, I'd never had any reason to fear working after dark. That was until just recently, when I became the subject of someone's obsession. Talking about this in the first place is very embarrassing for me. I feel like when people hear about this, they think I'm bragging about my looks or something, but I swear I'm not. I recognize that I'm an average-looking woman, but that's as far as my vanity goes. I would have kept this all to myself, but my therapist feels that sharing my experience will help other women. That's why we're here. Hopefully he's right, and this horrible ordeal can really serve to help others who suffered from the same form of negative attention. I guess it's time to tell you exactly what it is that happened. As I said, I work the night shift 6 days a week. The number of weirdos I encounter because of this is somewhat high. A fight once or twice a year, some homeless drunks, of course, the usual lot for a clerk in a convenience store in America. In spite of the craziness going on around me day to day, I managed to go unnoticed by any of those weirdos until around 6 months ago. At about that time, this particular man began coming to the store. Initially, it was only once or twice a week. Whenever he did, he wouldn't say anything to me either. As time passed on, his visits became more and more frequent. This, in itself, is not that odd. Anybody who's ever worked in a convenience store for any length of time can tell you that regulars come with the territory. Some people you'll see every day at the exact same time, some more than once even. So, at the time, I thought I was just developing a new regular. No need to be too concerned. A month into this routine, though, I noticed that he would always wait until I had 0 customers so I could ring him up personally. What made this so obvious was his concerted efforts to begin discussions with me. Although I found it funny then, I didn't realize I was encouraging him by engaging with him. Soon, the talks became much more personal. Less banal discussions. The first time I was asked if I had a boyfriend, I laughed it off, but the third and fourth were the first indication to me that I might be having a problem on my hands. My suspicions were cemented on the day that he randomly asked me out. Perhaps out of instinct, I said no immediately. I was very careful to be kind in the way I said it, though. In the moment, he seemed to take it well. However, another clerk told me later in that evening that the man was actually extremely angry. I guess I never really learned to read body language very well. The next time he came in, he refused to talk to me and didn't return to normal until a few days later, when he acted like nothing had ever happened. I got the impression he had decided to let it go. But just one day later, he asked me to go out with him again. This time, he said he meant it to be just friends, but once again, I declined. He made no efforts at all to hide his fury this time. The expression on his face as he stood there really frightened me. The week following this second incident, I spent most of my time hiding out in the office doing paperwork. A male clerk he seemed to have befriended told me he'd been repeatedly asking about me, but the clerk always just told him I was out. I took advantage of this friendship to ask the clerk to talk to the man on my behalf. I wanted him to ask the guy not to come in the store when I was working anymore. His most recent behavior had really scared me. They must have really had the discussion because I didn't see the guy after that for several days. Curious as to what was said, I asked the clerk what reaction the man had. He only answered by saying the man had severe anger problems and I should watch my back from now on. I'm not sure if that clerk thought that would make me feel any better, but obviously it made me far more scared. Still, the guy did stay away from the store during my shifts, and I didn't see him for a few weeks after. One day, during a shift change, I was talking to the day manager, and he mentioned a discussion he'd had with my stalker, as he called him. The manager made the remark in passing that he didn't normally see the man at that time of day, and the guy told him he'd stopped coming in on my shift because I thought I was too good for him. The manager said the man's eyes had blazed with anger as he said that. Certainly, I dodged a bullet. At least, that's what I thought initially. In the coming weeks, though, I would catch glimpses of him wandering through the parking lot. Sometimes he'd stand at the edge of the lot just out of sight of the lights and watch me for hours. The last time I caught him doing this, I called the cops. When they arrived, I explained the situation to them, but as you can imagine, they told me they couldn't do anything unless he blatantly threatened me. Of course, by the time they arrived, he was gone as well. I'm not sure, but I think calling the cops might have scared him a bit, because I didn't see him for a while after once again. Our last meeting was less than an hour after close, about a month ago. I had just finished the deposits and was preparing to leave the store. As I walked outside the office, heading to the door, I noticed the shadow of a person standing just outside the view of the lights, just as my stalker had done that one time. Terrified, I called the cops right away. There was no way I was going to leave the store alone at 12:50 a.m., with him waiting outside in the darkness. The cops showed up in less than 5 minutes, but naturally, the guy had already hid. I got the usual speech, but they were at least kind enough to volunteer to come around for the next week or two at closing and hang around for a bit, so I could lock up and drive away. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I heard the news. While I was engaging in work talk with the male clerk, he mentioned that my stalker had killed himself the week before. I didn't believe him, so we walked into the office and he brought the man's obituary up on the computer. Shocked would be an understatement. I knew I hadn't seen him since then, but I assumed the police presence at closing had just scared him off. It took me a few minutes to gather myself. I wasn't sure how to feel about this. While he clearly had become a danger to me, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Obviously, he had major anger issues, but I had no idea how bad his life had been outside the store. I've always often thought it was important to try and be empathetic towards others. On the other hand, though, the relief I felt, and still feel, often overrides any feelings of sadness or guilt I may have. I can only hope he's found as much peace in taking his life as I have. I know that sounds terrible, but honestly, can you blame me? Rest in peace. I truly hope you found the peace you so sorely needed. Just the other night, my aunt and I were drinking some beers around the fire pit in my backyard. when she told me a story I'd never heard her mention before. I'm not a very good writer, but the way she told it had me glued to my seat. Because of that, I asked her to write it down for me so I could share it with everyone else. She was a little bit nervous about the idea at first, but as soon as I convinced her she could write it in a way to remain anonymous, she agreed with me. I do warn everyone listening to this that the subject matter is very upsetting and may trigger those who have been victims of violence in the past. Remember, you were warned. It was sometime in the middle 1980s, and I was living in the Midwest with a friend from back home. We had been bouncing from temp job to temp job for the past 5 years or so. Late one night, we decided to stop at a liquor store to pick up some booze. Neither of us had jobs at the time, and she happened to notice a help wanted sign in the front window. The following day, she returned and asked about the job. By the end of the day, she had been hired. She'd always had a way about her, a way to put people at ease. It was the greatest character trait she had. I honestly don't believe she ever had an enemy a day in her life. Anyhow, while I continued my search for permanent employment, she was enjoying her job and making a lot of new friends to boot. She would often invite her coworkers over to our apartment after work to party together. We always had a really awesome time. They were all really good people. I even dated one of the guys she worked with. But it didn't work out due to extraneous circumstances. Then, just as life was starting to get good for us all, a terrible crime occurred, and I would lose my best friend forever. The night the murders happened, my roommate was doing her closing duties. Most of the staff had met up at the store to head over to our place together. Sometime just before she locked the doors, 2 guys came in and walked around the store. She waited for several minutes at the register before reminding them the store was closing. This was when the men pulled out their guns. One herded the staff together into the walk-in cooler, while the other locked the door and switched off the sign. Once they were back together, the leader, the guy who led everyone into the cooler, assured them no one would be harmed as long as someone opened the safe for them. They'd simply take the money and leave. No one spoke until the doorman whipped one of the girls across the head with his pistol. My roommate quickly told them that the only person who had the key to the safe was the day manager, and he wasn't there. This wasn't true, of course. He was at the back of the group comforting his girlfriend that had just been hit. Still, no one to this day understands why she lied. She often said that if she was robbed, she wasn't about to die for somebody else's money. The 2 robbers were beginning to get irritated, so my roommate mentioned that the money was still in the register. It was only around $30, but at least it was something. The 2 men ignored her, but the door guy walked out of the cooler and came back a few minutes later. They walked away a couple of steps and talked together in private. About what, no one can say. When they returned to the group, the leader was visibly angrier. He repeated what he'd said earlier, but this time no one said anything back. That's where it all went to crap. The leader's frustration boiled over. He took one step toward the group and kicked the young man in front of him. Then he opened fire on the entire group. For a solid minute, he and his accomplice emptied their guns into the victims. The only survivor, who just happened to be the day manager, said he'd been shot at least 4 times before they moved on to the next person. Even though he had tried to cover his girlfriend with his body, she was still hit multiple times herself. He lost consciousness soon after the shots stopped, so no one knows exactly when the shooters left. What is known for sure is that 5 innocent people lost their lives for $32.53. It was almost 9 hours before they were found. By then, anyone who could have been saved except the one had already died. His stay in the hospital lasted 2 weeks, and the month after that was spent in physical therapy, learning how to use his arms again. The last time I spoke with him was sometime in 1997. He was still seeing a psychologist twice a month. As far as I understand it, only one of the shooters was ever arrested, the door guy, and that was for a different crime. He was connected to the murders while serving time in prison. He eventually did cop to it, but would never give up who his partner was. he would only say they had been killed while committing another robbery. Nobody still involved in the case believed him, but until they find a clue connecting them to a name, the case is at a standstill. If you ask me who was the most affected by the killings, I would probably say it was that day manager, Ben. Not only had my roommate lied to protect him, his attempt to save the girl he loved failed, and he spent all night lying next to her, while she and 4 of his other friends slowly bled to death. I'd say in comparison, I got off easy. Don't get me wrong, many of those people were my friends too. One of them the best friend I've ever had, and not a week goes by that I don't think about them all. But when it comes to Ben, I can't help but think his life will never be the same again. Until last week, I worked a dead-end job at a gas station across town. This story is why I quit, and the crazy week that led up to it. About 2 weeks ago, my old man came into my room, woke me up, and started bitching about how lazy I was and how I needed to get a job. I didn't really have anything to say to this, honestly. Of course, he got even more mad because of that, though. He informed me that he had asked his friend to give me a job at his gas station. I would have appreciated if he would have asked me first, but of course he did not. My first shift also started in a few hours. Wow, what an asshole. So, after a super quick shower, I shot off to begin my first surprise day of work. I could tell the job was going to suck immediately. My dad's friend was a douche, and most of the other employees were too. One girl even thought she was Nicki Minaj or something. The whole time she was working, she was rapping or singing random R&B songs. For some reason, the king douche put her with me for every single shift, and I had to listen to this crap all the time. On the rare occasion she wasn't singing or rapping constantly, she would only talk about her baby daddy. As you can imagine, most of the time I was working, I wanted to eat a box full of Tide Pods and chase it with a jug of bleach. If you thought it couldn't get any worse though, you're wrong. When the owner wasn't around, her friends hung out at the store and did so for hours. I don't mean just 2 or 3 people either. I mean upwards of 20 or more. They would all park their cars right in front of the store where customers should have been able to park and play their stereos at astronomical levels. The bass was so bad it would even shake the windows sometimes. It was my perfect idea of a living hell. At some point, it even got to the point where I was having nightmares I was trapped in a gangsta rap video. And just like a gangsta rap video, a gunfight broke out at the store while we were working just 2 nights ago. One of my co-workers' friends had a beef with a gang member in another neighborhood, I guess. This beef had of course started as something relatively tame, but quickly escalated to extreme violence. My co-worker's friend got into a fight with the gang member's cousin, and must have messed him up pretty bad, because the gang member's cousin ended up in the hospital for several days. Because of this, they swore revenge, and that he was going to fill that guy with holes. A normal person would have laid low for a while if someone told him a gangster was now gunning for him, but none of my co-workers' friends could be called anything near normal. So, of course, they continued acting as if nothing was wrong, until the gang member spotted him loafing around and drinking booze in our parking lot. The shooting part of the nightmare didn't last long, but by the time it was through, 2 of my co-workers' friends were immediately dead, and 3 other innocent bystanders were injured as well. The guy who was the intended target of the attack got away completely unscathed. 2 of her female friends were amongst the people killed. I even saw one of the girls begging the paramedics not to let her die as they rushed her away. The 3 bystanders injured had absolutely nothing to do with the foolishness at all. Lucky for them, they got off with minor injuries. The worst of the 3 just happening to be myself. I received a graze to my knee and a direct hit to my shin as well. Holy hell, did that fucking hurt. My first call upon waking up today was to the store manager to let him know I was quitting immediately. He sounded like he had been expecting it, honestly. As far as I know, cut-rate Nicki Minaj was still working there, despite the fact her presence caused this entire thing to begin with. The shooting wasn't the whole reason I quit. The king douche not offering to pay my medical bills at all was the biggest reason. My dad didn't even say anything about this, even though the guy was supposed to be his friend. I haven't told him yet, but I'm sure his friend will call him sometime today and tell him. I don't give a flip if he gets mad at me for quitting or not. That job could never pay enough to make it worth getting shot, let alone twice. I'd rather work in the sewers than put up with all that crap I've had to deal with for the past 2 weeks. If that job means so much to him, he can go work there himself with his tightwad buddy and dollar store Nicki Minaj while they all wait to get shot. I've had enough of that. No more for me. Each year on the birthday of my brother, my father and I try to find a new way to ensure he's remembered. With Dad being out of the country this year, I had to celebrate his memory on my own. So I decided to write down my brother's life story and share it with others. Brian was always a little bit different than the other kids we grew up with. These days, I imagine a teacher would have labeled him as having autism and drugged the uniqueness out of him. I want to make it clear from the start that he was not mentally disabled. It was the exact opposite, in fact. He was so smart that he acquired the nickname the Brain in middle school. His intelligence made him very popular and a very good student as well. He even got to graduate a whole year early because he was so smart. College was more of the same until his junior year, when he began to have some problems. He started skipping classes and disappearing for days at a time. When we discovered he was hearing voices, my dad flew into town and took him to a doctor. It took a few, but eventually the diagnosis of schizophrenia was made, and he was put on medication. Even with the medication, though, it was obvious he was no longer going to make it in school. He moved back home soon after because of this. His first year was a series of ups and downs, while the doctors tried to find a medication that would work long term. He'd start a drug, do well for a few weeks, and then go back to disappearing. We found out that on one of his vacations that he'd been getting high on street drugs to suppress his symptoms. To our relief, though, just after the new year, they finally found a medicine that worked. Things pretty drastically improved after that. A program was started that was partnered with the county to help those with mental illnesses find employment. Brian signed up for it right away, and a month later he got a job at a convenience store just down the street. This proved to be a blessing and a curse as well. Now that he was doing well and working, his life was getting back on track after 2 long years of hell. He really loved that job and was happy to be back providing for himself. We were all finally able to move forward and live a semblance of a normal life. That's the way it stayed for the next 2.5 years. Then the store closed. Losing that job he loved so much sent Brian back into his old habits of sleeping on the streets and abusing drugs. When he was off his meds, he was a completely different man, one I could not recognize at all. He would be gone a few days, come back and restart his medicine and start doing well, but then for no reason at all stop altogether and disappear again for another week. Then, one day, just like that, he never came back. He had been missing for over a week at that point, when we started to really worry. He'd always come home before, so we gave him 3 more days before we started looking for him. We spent several more driving around town, going to all his usual haunts, but no one had seen him for over a week. At this point, we began to panic, so we did what we should have done in the first place. We went to the police. Though, since he was an adult with a history of psychological troubles, and we had no proof he'd been taken against his will, all we could do was file a simple report. The cops said they would keep an eye out for him, but that was the best they could do at this point. The only option we had left was to go home and hope Brian would show up once again. Longer and longer time went by, though, and the more worried I became. Dad didn't indicate anything about the understandable level of concern. At least, he didn't show it. Mom was the worst, though. She said more than once she had a really bad feeling, and she couldn't handle it well at all. Every day he stayed gone made me more anxious. Regardless of how I felt inside, though, I kept my feelings to myself and maintained a mask of optimism. After a year of no word, I determined that ever hearing from him again was completely up to him. I had no control over his life, and letting the possibilities eat me up from the inside was getting me nowhere. When he did come back, we would all welcome him with open arms. We did the best we could to get on with living. Dad and I managed to pull it off relatively well, but Mom didn't. The doctors eventually discovered a cancer in her breast after Brian had been gone about 5 years. I believe the stress of worrying about him 24 hours a day fed into this, and perhaps even caused it in the first place. Combined with her total disregard for treatment, no matter how much we begged, she was gone in less than 6 months. Now, it was just my dad and I. We were forced to pick up the pieces and move on again, or let it kill us too. Life carried on and nothing really changed. That was until 2 years later, when we finally received the call we'd been waiting for. But the news was not what we had expected. Earlier in the month, a family had purchased that old convenience store. They had hired a cleaning company to go into the place and clean up the mess left after almost 8 years of sitting closed. One morning, the crew was in the storage room, picking up the leftovers of a ceiling collapse, when they made a terrible discovery. The body of what was believed to be a man was buried under the pile of ceiling tiles and insulation. The police had no idea who it could be. There were no marks on the body visible to indicate the cause of death. Ultimately, at the end of a 3-week investigation, including autopsy and DNA tests, it was determined that body in the back room was Brian. They never arrived at a concrete answer of how he died, but drug paraphernalia was found near him. The strongest theory was overdose, but they didn't find any marks on him or anything like that. Whether on purpose or not, it'll never be known. So, there we were. Over 7 years after we lost him, Dad and I were burying him next to Mom in the family plot. That day was a hard one, but knowing where Brian was after all this time took away a bit of the sting. We only wish Mom had survived to see it. It turned out she had been right all along. Brian had been dead the entire time, just a few blocks down the road, in the one place he had left that gave him joy and helped him to feel normal again. Knowing that made me smile in a strange way. I look forward to this day every year, an opportunity to remember him and his far too short life. It's one of the few things left that makes me smile. Hopefully, Dad will be back from his work next year, and we can celebrate together again. It may be my last chance to do so. The disease that took my mom apparently picked me to be its next victim. If Dad's still working and I've moved on next year, do me a favor and share this story again. Brian was a beautiful man, and despite his troubles, he was loved by all those he met, and at the least he should always be remembered for that. Five or so years ago, before I met my husband Brian, I lived in a dinky little apartment complex just off of campus. My roommate then was another girl attending the university. Neither of us owned a car, so we had no choice but to walk the 3 blocks to a convenience store located across the street from the science building. Not a single day went by when we didn't need to pick up something and became well known by the people working there. One year, my roommate had a friend from back home, Nina, spending the week of spring break with us. She seemed cool enough, but she sometimes came across as abrasive to people she didn't know. Kinda had a big mouth, I guess. This trait made me laugh at times, but her severe rudeness could put us in a spot of trouble as well. On the Saturday night before she was scheduled to leave, we had a little get-together at our place. My roommate was with her boyfriend, so Nina and I were the only ones around at the time. Earlier that day, she had scored an ounce of bud from one of our neighbors. He would sell us a little bit from time to time. We were planning on smoking before everyone started showing up, but I realized we were all out of papers. Since we were going to have to pick up some beer anyway, we decided to head down to the store. We loaded up on plenty of drinks and snacks when we got there, and then headed back to the apartment. As we walked across the parking lot, though, we noticed some guys hanging out on the side of the building. They did yell some crude words at us, but that wasn't anything out of the norm. On occasion, when I went out to the store at night, there were always a couple of dudes hanging around. Sometimes they would make an off-color comment, but I would always just laugh it off. They weren't being mean or anything. I just thought they were having a bit of fun. Nothing was said after that. I'd walk on home and get no further problems from them. That night, though, I was with Nina, and she was not familiar with this little game being played. So, when the guys made their usual comments, she snapped off on them. "Fuck off, you bastards! Go to hell!" That reply did not go down well with them. They acted in a way I'd never seen before. They started calling us whores and stupid sluts. It may have ended there, but when Nina heard their reaction, she gave them the finger. It quickly escalated after that. 2 of the guys began to sprint after us, cursing the whole way. Understandably, I was terrified and started running away from them. Nina laughed as if we were playing a game or something, but looking back at them, I certainly didn't think they looked like they were playing around. They looked furious. I doubt any girl had ever spoken to them like that before, and it surely made them angry. Nina finally got the hint and began to run with me. Luckily, we weren't far from the apartment. We got to the door and inside before they could catch us. I locked the deadbolt behind us and took a big breath. Nina started to laugh again. She hadn't taken them seriously at all and must have seen it as some big joke. I didn't, though, that's for sure. Her laughing made me even angrier. I commenced on cussing her out, but she just continued to laugh. It seemed she had no ability to take anything seriously. And she wasn't even high yet. I'd had enough of her and headed into the kitchen to put up the beer and chips. On my way out of the kitchen and into my room, a loud pounding on the door started. I freaked out and hid under the window next to it. Nina stood frozen in front of the door, and her eyes grew as wide as saucers. I think she finally started to get it. The pounding continued, followed by loud cussing and calling us filthy names I don't dare to repeat here. Carefully, I stood up and peeked out a little crack in the blinds. There were 3 guys now, and they were pissed. Then things got far worse. My male neighbor, the one who sold us weed, came walking down the stairs yelling at the guys and asking them what their problem was. I began to feel a bit of relief. He was a big dude and I'd never seen anyone give him any trouble. However, before he could get anywhere by talking to them, all 3 guys jumped on him and started beating him. He went down quickly, but they continued to beat him by kicking him one after the other. All of a sudden, they heard Nina yelling through the door at them. She demanded they stop or she was calling the cops. They must have heard her because they turned back toward the door and started cussing at her again, laughing at the threat. I looked around the corner and saw Nina with her eyes stuck to the peephole, dialing 911 on her phone. She connected with the dispatcher and explained the situation as fast as she could. She sat quiet for a moment, listening, and then yelled back through the door. "The cops are on their way. You guys better get the fuck out of here." They continued to laugh, but soon stopped and began talking amongst each other. One more curse was uttered, and one of them spat on the door. Then they looked at each other and ran off. I let out a giant sigh. I could finally breathe again. I wanted to go out and check on my neighbor, but was still way too terrified to go outside. He was laying motionless as I looked out at him. I started praying and asking for him not to be dead. About a minute later, I saw some beams from flashlights, followed by 4 cops walking carefully toward the door. One crouched down and checked my neighbor's pulse. I could hear the words "faint pulse" as he spoke through his radio. When the officers knocked on the door, Nina opened it for them. She gave the one in front a big hug and kiss on the cheek. He stood there, frozen in surprise. She let go, and they all entered the apartment. We thanked them for showing up so fast, and Nina began blurting the entire story before they even had time to ask. I hurried out behind them to check on my neighbor. A paramedic came up right after and started working on him. I asked them if my neighbor was going to be okay. He simply looked at me and said he should make it, but he'll have to fight. It wasn't the news I wanted to hear, but I was happy to hear he was likely to survive. When his partner arrived soon after, they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him away. Even though I wanted to go with them, I knew I had to stay behind and talk to the police. I went and sat back down and waited to be questioned. The cops left a few hours later. I was still shaking a little from the shock of everything. I felt bad for what happened to my neighbor. He didn't deserve that. He was just trying to help us. If I would have had a car, I would have went to the hospital to check on him, but unfortunately I didn't. I couldn't think of anything better than a beer and some smoke to help me relax. I was overjoyed that no one decided to show up for our party that night. Things could have turned out far worse. While we sat in front of the TV and smoked, Ina apologized for almost getting us killed. I was happy to hear it, but I wasn't the person she really needed to apologize to. She agreed and stayed a day longer to go with me on the bus to see him, in the hospital, and to apologize in person. Like any real hero, he said there was no need, and asked how we were instead. We spent most of the day with him, until they eventually kicked us out. Nina left the next morning, and happily, I've never seen her again. My neighbor Alex spent the whole next week in the hospital recuperating from the attack. When he returned to the complex, my roommate and I had him over for dinner. She figured it was the least we could do to thank him for helping, and of course, I agreed. For the remainder of the time I lived there, I would see him from time to time, never forgetting to thank him for what he did. He managed to bounce back from his injuries as well. Unfortunately, although his limp eventually went away and the cuts healed, he'll most likely have slight memory issues for the rest of his life. I can only hope he's able to move on and forget myself, Nina, and the whole mess that was caused because of all of it. This story happened a few months ago. At that time, I had moved out of my house for a professional reason. I had to wait a couple of months, though, before moving into my next house. To spend this intervening time span, and since I can work from anywhere pretty much, I rented my very close friend Amy's holiday family house, which otherwise had been left empty. It was located in a village I grew up in the countryside. I know this family and their house very well, ever since I was a very small child. The house was rather large, with 2 floors and 5 bedrooms. It was located in a quiet, very remote area of the village, only surrounded by forest and other empty holiday homes. While planning this, I was aware that this setting could be quite scary, being a single 27-year-old female. But I hated to restrain myself in life just because of some unfounded fears. I decided instead to take a few measures to feel more safe. Before moving in, I planned to do a complete checkup of all the doors and windows. Once done, I would look into every room, under every bed, and inside all the wardrobes. That way I could be certain the house was perfectly empty at the moment, and would stay so in the future. I would be very careful with all the doors, and I would not leave any spare keys lying around. When at night, even if scared, I could reason with myself easily and know it was all in my head. I was accompanied by my mother to do the checkup, as she lived very close by. We faced a problem very quickly, whilst verifying the doors and windows. 2 of the glass doors on the patio seemed to be malfunctioning, and you could just slide them open very easily. The layout of the 2 doors was the following. One was looking towards the garden, the second one between the patio and the rest of the house. This meant someone could not only get inside the patio from outside, but also into the rest of the house as well. After this startling discovery, I called up my friend Amy, and we agreed I would get a locksmith to come out there and change this. Amy's financial situation with her family was not exactly at its peak. So depending on the price, either only the door leading to the garden or both doors would get fixed. The price was reasonable, thankfully, and thus the locksmith lady could change both locks at the same time. The patio was now perfectly sealed. However, according to her, the glass door leading to the garden was weak, and one could easily open it no matter the lock if sufficiently motivated. It appeared the glass door between the patio and the rest of the house was safe though, so even if they could get that far, they couldn't get any further. One could have as much fun as they pleased on the patio, as long as I was safe inside the house myself. After that, and successfully clearing the second checkup, I was more than happy to move in. The first days were a bit scary, of course, but since I was careful with the doors and the house's surroundings were so peaceful and lovely, I quickly forgot about this, and it became absolute bliss to live there. I was heating myself with a quaint fireplace, eating good food, breathing in all this fresh air. I was very free and happy. Only, I had noticed a small odd detail after the first few days. There was a third glass door that suddenly was not locking properly anymore. I got very surprised, since I'd checked this very carefully during my initial checkup. This third door was right next to the one I'd gotten repaired as well, between the patio and the house. This meant the patio was not perfectly sealed anymore. It was still fine, I thought. All the doors leading to the outside were still locked, so no need to worry too much. I quickly moved on since I felt so happy there. I didn't want any useless fears to bog me down. I came to the conclusion that I must have simply missed it the first time through. I was a bit ashamed I got Amy's family to spend that money on those 2 locks, whereas it should have been 3 to complete the set, all because of my own carelessness. After 2 wonderful months of living this dream mostly on my own, since all my childhood friends moved out from the village, a friend came to visit me. We spent some time outside, and we had a drink at this place before I drove him back to his house, about an hour away or so. While we were leaving, he even emphasized how meticulous I was with making sure everything was closed and locked up tight. I told him it was the key for me to feel so good and safe there. When I got back home, it was around 10 p.m. I entered the home and locked the door behind myself. But while turning the key, out of the blue, intense goosebumps began to shoot all over my body. I had never experienced such a feeling before. I was not even aware that the human body could get goosebumps on the scalp itself. With that also came a very distinctive feeling of being in danger. My guard went up instantly. I felt so intensely that I was not able to ignore it at all. I knew that I'd kept the house perfectly closed, though. I stayed cautious, but I walked through the entrance and slowly into the kitchen. I saw on the floor a rectangular plastic bag. It was small and blue on the orange floor. I was surprised. I recognized it as being a plastic bag that was supposed to be filled with water to make ice cubes. Well, that certainly was not supposed to be there. I had seen these earlier, once I was looking for freezer bags to put my food in. I knew they were stored in a drawer at the other side of the kitchen, and I knew I did not use them. This uncanny discovery confirmed my gut feeling. I quickly sent a picture to my friend, asking if he'd touched or used these. Of course, he said no. I picked up a knife and started to slowly walk in the living room. Usually, whenever I would feel afraid in this house, I would go on a little checkup tour in every room to reassure myself. That was what I had in mind at this moment, but that gut feeling was literally forbidding my body to do so. Instead, I walked out of the house and drove to my mother's place. I slept there instead. I didn't get up the courage to come back until a few days later, during a bright sunny afternoon. My mother came with me, and we did another thorough checkup. Nothing was missing, nor broken, nor was anyone found there. Everything was exactly as I had left it. With all this evidence, I came to the conclusion that maybe it was my friend who by accident took those bags and forgot about them. Then they must have fallen on the floor while I opened the door, or something like that. I came back in and kept living the dream in this beautiful place for another month after. Then, though, something else happened. For a few days, I had been hearing these unusual noises outside, which began to scare me. I decided it was time for another checkup. It was around 9 p.m. I began going room through room, looking under every bed. Downstairs, all clear. I walked upstairs, opened the first bedroom, and to my surprise, the light was on. This caused me a small flinch. I never used these rooms upstairs, and they remained closed at all times. I walked toward the wardrobe, but just before I was about to open it, I felt a second flinch, as an unknown object seemed to be laying on top of the furniture. I opened it. Nobody was there. I closed it again and looked at this strange object. It was an elongated sheath of some sort, with a hook to carry it on a belt. The idea crossed my mind that this appeared to be a knife's sheath. I brushed it off. I didn't need my imagination going crazy in such a situation. I finished my checkup, but despite nobody being found, I couldn't help but feel weird about that sheath and the light. I went to sleep at my mother's place once again. The day after, I checked with my friend Amy. No family members had returned to the house while I was away, nor did they recognize the object as belonging to any of them. I dropped it off at the police station, and according to them, it was a hunting knife sheath indeed. Then I started thinking about that third patio door. It had been coming to my mind for some weeks. Reflecting back on my thorough entrance checkup, it's unlikely I would have missed such a detail. As well, the locksmith had changed the lock to the door right next to this one, and even stared at it as well. There's no way she would have missed that. I talked with Amy. We first imagined that perhaps an old Airbnb tenant made a copy of the keys or something. But more and more, I was sure that there had been some sort of sabotage. I had another locksmith come and look at the third door's lock. Indeed, she found the lock part screwed on the door frame where the lock embeds itself had been unscrewed and taken off. She also checked the door leading to the garden that her colleague had pointed out as easy to open. It had also had a similar occurrence. I left the house for good after that. I believe a person had their little habits in this home, using the way I checked when I arrived and making sure to be able to reach inside the place despite my changes, thinking that all this time I was living my life peacefully, reasoning with myself to not be scared, and that the place was actually safe and locked, when it never really was, really shook me. Okay, so bear with me. This happened when I was a kid, and I double-checked the details with my family as well. This happened in the mid-80s or so. I was about 7, at home with 2 of my older sisters, 8 and 11 at the time, and 2 cousins as well. They were 7 and 8-ish. All 5 of us were girls. My sister, the 11-year-old one, was in charge of babysitting us 4 younger ones. You have to picture what our house looked like to understand what happened. It was a 2-story box house with a flat roof and a small box front porch, also with a flat roof. I can't remember what we were all doing, but I do remember we were all inside the house. We kept on hearing these noises coming from the roof, like walking, and what sounded like rocks being dropped down the downspouts. You know kids, though. We thought it must be a squirrel or something, but it kept on happening over and over for a long period of time. Then my older sister said something about how maybe someone had climbed the huge tree beside the home and climbed up onto the roof. We were all scared now because we knew there was a roof access point in the bedroom that I shared with one of my sisters. What if this person could get inside? My oldest sister told my other sister and one of our cousins to walk across the street to the corner store, across an empty gravel parking lot. On the way back, they would look up and see if someone truly was on the roof. So, both the girls, about 8, walked halfway across the parking lot. Being curious kids, they turned around, looked up, and saw a man in a football jersey crouched down on our roof. The girls came running home, freaking out, and told my sister about the guy. My older sister was freaking out as well. First, she ran to the neighbor's house to use their deck to see if she could see onto the roof as well. She couldn't see the man anymore, though. She ran and called the police. It felt like it took them ages to even show up. When they did get there, I don't think they believed a word we said. They thought a bunch of kids were making up this story for attention. One cop drove down the road up a hill about a block away to see if they could see anything either. The way our roof was, though, you could not see a person if they were laying down. The cops told us that we had to go upstairs ourselves and check everywhere to see if we found anyone. 5 little girls, ages 7 to 11, sent upstairs, scared shitless and crying to look for this man ourselves. We knew about the roof access, and we all cried not wanting to go, but the cops said we had to. To this day, I still remember how scared I was. And the cops just wouldn't listen to us. They didn't check the house at all, inside or out. They simply left. We were so scared to be left home alone now and the guy, who knows where he was now. We didn't know if he was simply laying down on the roof still, or had jumped down and went into hiding. My mom finally got home a few hours later. We told her what happened, and my mom explained to us that there had been a lock on the roof access anyway, so no one could get in. We were thankful for that, even though we hadn't known about it at the time. She went to check on the outside of the roof. There were clear footprints in the dirt, dug in good from him jumping off and onto the porch. It appeared there were footprints in the flower bed as well. My mom was steaming mad when she realized we'd told the truth and the police hadn't believed us. We went to the police station the next day and were all separated and interviewed. We all told the same story. My mom went up one side of the cops and down the other. We never found out who the guy was or why he was there. My mother was stationed at Kadena Air Force Base around the late 2010s. Being a military child at the age of 12, my life had been reset once again. I didn't have any friends, and I had to learn an entirely new neighborhood. I didn't really have anything that made me ecstatic. That is, except the Pokemon League on base. It was ran by a few people who earned their judge cards from Nintendo. They held tournaments and open game nights as well. It was so fun, picking up the card game, playing the video game. They even had their own small gym and Elite Four system. I made a lot of friends there, and one of them was one of the judges. I'm still thankful to that judge to this day, because if it was not for him, I may not be here right now. The judge in question we'll call Professor Getsu for the sake of anonymity. He was an extremely nice dude. He was the youngest of the three judges, and always wore a Pokemon professor getup. He looked maybe to be on the edge of his teens or early 20s or so, with dark hair, glasses, and a skinny frame. He was extremely helpful to all us newcomers, sort of like the big brother we could all look up to and strive to beat with our children's cars and video games, even if his game name Getsu was a bit nerdy even for me. He was always one of the last people to leave, helping to clean up and live nearby as well. That last thing is important for what happened. It was a colder night, and the event had just ended. I was sitting outside in the parking lot, scrolling through some memes my friends had texted me as I waited for my parents to arrive and pick me up. I was beginning to zone out as the time clicked by when I heard someone nearby call out to me. Hey girlie, you play Pokemon? I looked up at some really huge dude, kinda chubby looking. I would see him every now and then at events, and he never really stood out too much. I gave a small nod and said, yeah, I do, as he gave me this wide smile, creepily wide. He started walking forward, and immediately I was hit with a nasty stench, what I guessed must be bad body odor. I blinked a bit, as I saw he was walking to me from a black sedan, waiting with its back doors open. I got this cool card collection. Come here, let me show ya. Now, my parents had already taught me stranger danger, but my kid brain thought, hey, he goes to the same events as me, and I see him around all the time. Surely it must be fine. That was what I thought, until he firmly grabbed my wrist and started to drag me off my feet to the sedan. To say I started screaming immediately is an understatement. Old Stinky Pete over here didn't care though. He was still dragging me, saying how much fun it would be, throwing out things about trading cards, like someone listening would think that he was dealing with a whiny kid. I honestly thought I was about to be taken, and I would never see my mom or dad again, that I would be on the back of a milk carton, never to be seen. Silly, I know, but I was rather sheltered about dying and death at the time. Thankfully, Professor Getsu was walking out at that very moment, presumably just on his way to walk home. All I know is that all of a sudden, I heard the sound of fabric slapping the man's face. The professor had swung his coat right in the man's face and smacked him as hard as he could. I could feel his hand go down to where the man was grabbing my arm. He grabbed Stinky Pete's pinky finger and yanked it back hard. Stinky let go and yowled like an animal as the professor pushed me back behind him. He yanked his coat off the dude, then kicked the back of the man's knees and caused him to buckle to the ground. The professor grabbed his wrists and pulled them behind him, then placed his knee in the middle of his back. Stinky groaned in even more pain as the professor looked at him with a cold look in his eyes. The big brother figure was now gone, and in its place was something more threatening. Even I was a bit scared looking at him. His tone of voice when he spoke didn't help either. Icy daggers lingered in his words. "If I see you back here, doing this shit to my charges, I'll make it pale in comparison to what Japanese prisons would do to you." Stinky scrambled away and ran to his car. He peeled out of the parking lot. The professor glared at him till he was out of sight. Then he guided me back inside the venue to buy me some fish and chips. He sat down with me until my parents arrived. The cold persona he'd had when he kicked the dude's ass was gone, back again to being the big brother I knew. To be frank, that kind of frightened me. I didn't understand why he'd gotten so aggro immediately. I only later learned that the professor was also a person who taught kids how to defend themselves with his mother at the local activity center. I suspect he developed something of a protective persona because of this. He explained the situation to my folks when they arrived. I wasn't allowed to go to the events and league as much as I used to, but I still did from time to time. The professor was still his normal self at all the events and always helping people as well. He stopped coming about a year afterwards since his license expired and his father was moving out of the country soon. Reaching about the same age he was, and with a little sibling of my own, I sympathized with how for a brief moment he became something so terrifying just to make sure I was safe. Oh, and as for old Stinky, he never showed up at the events again. Either he was banned or he'd been so scared of the professor that he just never came back. I wish the professor a good life and hope he's doing well today as well. I need to get this off my chest. My fiancé, 27 and male, and I, 23 and female, are soon to be married and are remodeling an old family home. We started working on the house about 2 or 3 months ago, actually. My fiancé bought a bunch of tools to use on the house to renovate. The house had been sitting with nobody in it for over a year now. Keep in mind, it was also located in a fairly rural area. There were a few homes and trailers here and there, but really not much traffic, and very far in between all of them. We had a bit of a rodent problem, and had been setting up some traps to catch them. 3 weeks ago, my fiancé went to check the traps, and we had a rat that was still alive. Long story short, he didn't want to take care of it, so he left. I got off work at 9 p.m. and went over to the house to see what I could do about this rat. It was raining, and my mom and brother came with me. I went to the back door, only to find it was wide open, and water was blowing into the house. I was beyond pissed. I thought my fiancé had left the door open when he'd gone. I shut it up and finished my business there. When my fiancé returned, I asked him quite angrily why he'd left the door open, and he claimed he never had. I'd simply called bullshit and left it at that. It didn't ever occur to me for some reason that somebody could have possibly been in there and made a quick getaway when I arrived. Fast forward to today. My fiancé and I went about our house to throw a whole bunch of trash and things into a dumpster we had rented. When we went inside, I immediately noticed that some things were now missing. Drills, sanders. We realized they must have been stolen. I called my mother-in-law and told her about it, and she said to make a police report. What scared me so much about this is that as we did so, everything began to click with that rat trap incident. Somebody had been scoping us out. I would go to our house by myself on many occasions, and I would always have the creeps and feel like I was being watched. My little brother had even remarked before that he felt watched there, and asked if we were sure nobody was in there while we were gone. I noticed today when I was there alone, my dog was acting very nervous and suspicious. She wasn't running around and playing like she usually did, and really didn't want me to go to the backyard or wooded area. I decided to trust her and my gut feeling. I don't know if there are thieves out there in those woods or what, but I really kinda don't want to find out. We're currently in the process of installing some cameras. This had to have been somebody that lives nearby and can monitor how often we're there. Update. We did catch a car pulling in like it was scoping the place out. The people inside never left their car, but they did wait around for a while. We asked a few of my fiance's family members about this, and that was to our detriment. One of them went and spread the word that we had cameras, and somebody in the neighborhood who owned the same type of vehicle we caught on camera slipped up and said they already knew things had been stolen. This to me was basically a confession because we hadn't told anybody about any robbery, at least until the incident with the car was caught on camera. Now, more people than necessary know, and we probably won't ever catch the specific person who did it. We still turn the footage into the police though. Maybe they can dig up some background info. My mom was a single parent of 3 kids. We were pretty poor, so she worked pretty much 24/7. This meant that as kids, my siblings and I spent a lot of time home alone. Well, this story happened when I was 14, at the very start of summer. My older sister had moved out by then, and my little brother got sent to stay with my grandpa for the summer. This meant I was home alone from about 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every weekday. I didn't really mind too much though. I spent most of that time playing Neopets or watching awful daytime TV. Well, one day, I had not long woken up, and my mom had gone to work hours earlier. It was around 12 p.m. or so. I got up to make some food, let my dog outside, and settled down on my bed to eat a bit. I remember watching Rock of Love, and remember exactly the bit of show I was watching too when this happened, even though it happened so many years ago. As I was sitting there watching, I heard a loud smack on my window. My window was a double window that needed 2 blinds, 2 curtains, etc. This meant there was a tiny gap where you could see through the very middle of them, where they didn't quite touch together. I saw a shadow along with that sound. I also heard some logs falling down. Outside my window, there was a pile of firewood for the winter. I got up and walked over, thinking perhaps a branch or something had smacked against it, and that's when I saw it. A huge handprint left on my window right where the tiny gap was between my blinds. I freaked the fuck out. I couldn't even breathe. I was so scared. I called 911 and then my next door neighbor, who was a family friend. He ran over as soon as I said what happened, and he found the guy there still. A man in his mid-40s, sprinting out of my backyard into the street ahead. My neighbor tried to keep him there until the police arrived. When they got there, I told them what happened. They looked into the guy to see if he had a past, but nothing seemingly came up. He had been dating and living with another neighbor 3 doors down from my house for a few months. When asked what he was doing at my window, he told us he was never there. He was just looking for something. I don't remember his exact excuse. I just remember him saying it happened to be in my backyard. The police got a statement from him, and the neighbor who caught him and myself thought it would help to get him put away or something. I know, it's stupid, but I was a teen. I didn't know any better. They just let him go and didn't do anything. I waited to hear from them regarding next steps we could take, but I never got another reply. From then on, my anxiety was awful. I had motion lights set up outside my window as well, making sure I was never sleeping alone too. But it wasn't enough. I could never rest. Now I felt like I was constantly being watched everywhere. Who knows, maybe I could have been. How did this guy know I would be home alone? What did he want to find me doing? I felt so unsafe. Fast forward 2 months later. I'm staying with my best friend who lived across the street from me, and we were both in the shower. We saw a shadow walk up to the bathroom window. It was glazed over, so you couldn't see anything properly. I wiped off some of the steam, and who do I see? That guy from my window the other time, running away from the bathroom as I popped it open. I told my friend who it was, and we both freaked out together. We called the cops again, and again they did nothing. Worst part was, no one even believed me, minus the guy who'd found him the first time. My mom told me I was too fat for a guy to want to creep on me, and that I was just being dramatic. Nothing happened to the guy. He did this multiple times after, and I have to wonder how many others he did it to as well. The woman he was living with had a very young daughter at the time too. It still haunts me, though I guess it shouldn't. It just scares me. We can go on with our lives, and someone could be watching and waiting to prey on us, and we would never know. What would he have done that night if he hadn't accidentally knocked the firewood logs over? I'll never know. First, I guess I should say that when I was growing up, my mom had a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues. One of the more minor things she suffered from was extreme anxiety and social awkwardness, but in this case, it had a significant impact on what would come. I must have been around the age of 8 to 10 years old. I can't remember exactly. We lived in a very small town in the north of Scotland, which also happened to be only a mile or so away from a sort of spiritual retreat that was fairly well known. And because we had this spiritual place so close to us, we would get a lot of, shall we say, weird people coming into town. Now, I don't mean to suggest that spiritualness always equals weirdness, but the reality is, it did attract a lot of strange people to the area. One day, I, my mom, and my little brother went up the high street to get some groceries, just a usual Friday afternoon. Outside the grocery store, just before making our way home, there was this guy with a large dog. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what breed it was, but it was one of those huge ones with the beautiful pure white fluffy fur. My brother and I were fascinated by it. The guy got to chatting with my mom for what seemed like an eternity. Eventually, she managed to get him to stop bothering her, and we started walking home. The guy with the dog had this van. Instead of just saying goodbye and going on his way, he shoved his dog in the back and proceeded to drive behind us at a pace slower than we were walking at. When we got home, he parked right outside our front door. When we got in, my mom shut the curtains and said to just ignore him. On Saturday morning, my brother and I got up early. When we peeked out the curtains, he was still there, standing with his dog right outside the wall to our garden and staring in through our living room window. It feels weird to even say this now, but honest to God, our mom made us turn off all the lights and crawl around so the guy would think we were not home. For the next 2 days, he stayed outside our house, coming up to our door, banging on it. When he got no response, he would come to the living room window and slam on that, shouting he knew we were home. He just wanted to be friends. Lots of things like that. Eventually, after almost a week of this, he finally fucked off. I know how weird it is now that my mom didn't just call the police or a friend for help, but I guess I can forgive her for suffering mental health issues at the time. As for the guy though, I have no idea what he was thinking doing all that shit. This happened when I was around 12 years old. It was in the middle of the night at my home. My dad would work the graveyard shift at work. Since it was the weekend, I had stayed up most of the night. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m. My dad had told me to lock the doors and go to sleep, which I had done. I went to my room and finally fell to bed. After I went to my room, I'd only slept for about an hour though. At around 2 a.m., I was suddenly woken up to the sound of knocking on my back door. It scared me wide awake. After taking a few moments to process what I'd just heard, I decided it was probably just my dad knocking on the door. Maybe he'd forgotten something. Being mentally exhausted, I knew he had a house key on him. I told myself he'd just unlock the door on his own eventually. But the knocking continued. It was pretty creepy. Next thing I knew, the knocking had suddenly stopped. Then it started again at a different location. Someone was knocking on the window to my kitchen. I continued to try and assure myself it was just my dad. I didn't understand though. Why couldn't he just unlock the door himself? He always had the key on him. Thinking about this a bit more, I was starting to get pretty freaked out. I wasn't going to answer the door. If anything, my dad would eventually call me to open it for him. My phone was right next to me, but no such call ever came. The knocking started again at another window. I was terrified now, too scared to get up and check what was out there. The knocking would not stop. Next thing I know, it moved to the front door, and they began to slam at a harsher level too. That's when it hit me that I couldn't bring myself to move. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't bring myself to scream or talk or move any muscle. My heart was dropping as the knocking moved to a window closer and closer to my bedroom. My curtains were see-through. I couldn't do anything. I didn't know what I could do. I could only stay as my fear consumed me. I moved my eyes to the window. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a man peeking in through it, a tall man with a ski mask covering his face. I could hardly make out the details because it was so dark. His mask had some sort of skeleton design on it, and he tilted his head slightly as he noticed I'd seen him. I tried to say anything, but my words choked in my throat. I closed my eyes hard and started whispering to myself that it was not real, over and over again. I opened my eyes. No one was there. I breathed a sigh of relief until I heard a loud whisper from outside. "Open up or I'll cut you." Everything suddenly stopped. I could finally move again, but I couldn't really sleep anymore that night. It didn't feel like a dream. Everything felt so real. I don't know what happened, but I pray I'll never have to experience that again. It was one of the most frightening moments in my life I've ever dealt with. I couldn't find any trace of the guy after, though. I was home alone that day too, so nobody could back me up. The following morning, I asked my dad when he came back from work if he'd come back earlier that day and knocked on my doors and windows. Of course, he did not. My family used to move around a whole lot. That meant that when I was younger, I was almost always changing schools. It got to be very hard to make friends, not only because of all the moving, but because I always expected to be leaving again very soon. That kept me from wanting to form new attachments. We moved so often it seemed futile. I mostly just kept to myself whenever I entered a new school. Well, of course, anyone who's been to school knows exactly how the loners are treated, especially in middle school. That was where I was in my education when this story takes place. My family had just moved to a semi-rural area. I remember this being the worst time in my life, and I still consider it to be that way, honestly. I was in the 7th grade, and I remember this year I turned 13. I had always been a bit of a small kid, and the fact that I was so quiet and a loner just made this whole thing worse on me. The bullying started pretty early, and it got pretty nasty too. In fact, it had gotten so bad I would try to make myself sick in the morning to avoid going to school. I would wear wet socks to bed or put dirty things in my mouth. Back then, we actually thought something like that could make you sick. There was constant name-calling. Kids would always try to force me into fights with them. I never wanted to fight, and there was never any reason. I remember once these two bullies held me, while another burst a water balloon on me. Then they went around joking and telling everyone I had a wet dream. It was humiliating, just being at that school. The worst part is that the teachers never did anything about it. It happened on the bus, too. A few of the guys who gave me a hard time at school were on the same bus as me and lived in the same general area I did. Fortunately, I lived 45 minutes away and out in the country, so being home was the best thing for me. I would never encounter anyone else who tormented me way out there. Summer vacation, because of this, was my favorite time of year. In that particular summer, it was even more welcome than before. I was able to just be home and not have to deal with the constant torment that was visited upon me. One of my favorite things to do was go out exploring into the woods. I would do that maybe a few times a week during the summer. There were a lot of woods in the area, so I was never short of spaces to explore. Sometime in the middle of the summer, I was out exploring in an area I'd never been in before. I'd come across some berry bushes and was surprised to find a good haul of blackberries. I decided I would pick them and bring some home, because they were pretty good actually. As I was walking along, I found a dead squirrel. It was obvious the squirrel had been shot and just left there to die. Whoever had shot it was doing it for fun, not for food. I found a bird in a similar condition. It was heartbreaking to see any of this. I wondered why people like to kill animals for fun. As I was out hiking this new area, I began to hear what sounded like footfalls every now and then. I'd never encountered any other people when I was out exploring before. I'd only once in a while come across an animal that wasn't a bird or a squirrel even, but I'd never seen anything dangerous out here. The footfalls I was hearing seemed like there was something bigger. I didn't think there were things like dangerous cats or anything like that around, but I did get a bit concerned when I heard what sounded like someone laughing. Then I knew if I had heard this correctly, there was a person out here in the woods following me. My first thought was I was about to get in trouble for trespassing. I didn't know who owned the land I was exploring on, so I began to get a little bit scared. I decided to go back towards my house, or at least try to find a road to walk along. I went off and kept hearing sounds that indicated someone was in the woods following me. I kept looking around, trying to see who it could be, but whenever I looked in the direction of the noises, they'd stop immediately, and I wouldn't see anything. Then I'd hear the laughing begin again. When I turned around to face it the last time, my heart froze in my chest. I was terrified. I was looking at a kid named Billy, one of my worst bullies in school. He was with a bully friend of his, Kyle, and the scariest thing of all was that both of them had rifles. They emerged from behind the trees to face me. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified at the scary looks on their faces. I thought about those dead animals. I was positive it was these two that had killed them. Kids my age shouldn't be out in the woods with rifles. I'm sorry. Being 13 and doing that sort of thing is just wrong. The proof I have of this? Both of them pointed their rifles at me right away. Billy taunted me, calling me horrible names and racial slurs. Then they said I was dead. I turned around to run. As soon as I did, I heard a gunshot ring out. I didn't feel anything, so I know I didn't get shot myself. But needless to say, I was terrified. I fell down to the ground. Kyle and Billy ran up to me and pointed their rifles at me. They called me names and made fun of me because I was scared. I didn't want to move. I just laid there on the ground, hearing their insults and being terrified. It was the worst feeling I'd ever had in my life. Then the most amazing thing happened. "Billy, what the fuck are you doing?" I heard a man's voice call out. "Oh, hey, Dad. We were just playing around, weren't we?" he asked me. He had a look in his eye that said he would shoot me if I didn't agree. "They were hunting me," I told Billy's dad. A huge man came up and grabbed the rifle out of Billy's hand and put it on the ground. He said 4 words I'll never forget. "Cut me a switch." Billy looked terrified. He took out his pocket knife and cut a switch from a bush or something. He handed it to his dad, and his dad began to beat him with the switch in front of all of us. Billy was reduced to tears, and I could tell Kyle was scared he would be next too. Lucky for him, Billy's dad deigned not to punish him. "Help him up," the dad demanded, and Billy did as he was told. "You apologize right now." Billy apologized, and the dad asked me if I was all right. I told him I was fine. He grabbed the rifle in one hand and Billy with the other, and he dragged the two of them off. I think Billy was going to be a lot worse for wear when he got home with his dad. Although my story does have a fortunate ending, it was a terrifying experience. Bullies are scary to begin with, but bullies willing to kill are much worse. Billy didn't bother me again after that. He just gave me horrible looks in school, but he never talked to me from then on. A lot of neighborhoods have quote-unquote haunted houses in them. You know the exact kind I mean. Houses that are for some reason abandoned and boarded up for a long time. No one really seems to know why, so all the children just decide the house must be haunted or something. The older kids make up weird stories about it, just in order to scare their siblings and their friends. It's always just a bunch of bullcrap. But it becomes legend with the kids in the neighborhood. My neighborhood had something even better than that. You see, we had this old abandoned hospital. That's all I really knew about it, really. I knew it had been abandoned for a very long time. The kids in the neighborhood all claimed it was a mental hospital, but I never really verified that for sure. We had this little town legend about it, at least amongst us kids. So the story went that this was a mental hospital, but when they closed it down, the patients were released back into society. One of the patients, a man the kids called Lucky, not the cleverest nickname, but we're kids after all, considered the place to be his home and returned to living in it years afterward. Supposedly, this man lived in the basement and would try to kill anyone who ever entered his home. The kids in the neighborhood would always dare each other to break in and spend time in that old hospital. No one would ever actually do it, though. I'd been dared before myself. The closest I'd ever gotten was climbing over the gate. Once I was on the other side, though, I'm not too proud to admit I chickened out immediately and hopped back over. There was one kid in the neighborhood that did take the dare completely, so this story is not a first-hand account of what happened inside. It almost scared me to death not knowing what really happened to him. I was a high school freshman on Halloween. A bunch of us headed down to the hospital to go about the usual daring. Some of us would go right up to the gate, begin to climb over, and then chicken out right away. One kid, though, that I didn't really know well, named Tom, was teasing us all mercilessly for being such cowards. He kept telling us that the stories of Lucky were just a bunch of baloney, and we were dumb for being so scared. About 6 of us had all chickened out and were being teased by this guy. We'd had enough of his crap. We told Tom that unless he was willing to put his money where his mouth was, he needed to shut the hell up. We were wrong in assuming that Tom was going to chicken out like us, though. He readily accepted our challenge and began to climb over the gate. He climbed over easily and jumped down on the other side. Then he waved at us and walked over to the door of the hospital. He actually tried to open the door as well. That was more than any of us had ever done before. It didn't work, though. The door was locked. This actually gave Tom the chance to back out, but he didn't. After looking around for a bit, he found a large rock and used it to shatter one of the windows. We all got worried, of course. We thought the noise would attract somebody to the site, but that didn't happen. Tom broke the glass out of the basement window and then carefully lowered himself inside and out of sight. We were all pretty shocked at this point and a bit ashamed of ourselves as well. The shame that we felt, though, in no way compared to the paranoia that settled in on us as we waited for Tom to come back out. At first, we were just impressed he'd even gone in. Then, we were more impressed that he was staying in there for quite a while. That feeling of being impressed, though, began to fade into worry. Longer and longer, Tom still did not come back out of the hospital. It was bad enough when an hour had passed, even worse when 2 hours had passed, and absolutely dreadful when nearly 4 hours had passed by and not a single peep from Tom. It really began to bug us. We weren't sure why he hadn't come back out yet, but we were definitely speculating on it. Our first thought was that he was taking his time to try and scare us. The worst thought, and the one that became more and more realistic to us kids as time went on, was that Tom must have really come across Lucky, and he must have been unhappy to have someone invading his home. And Tom's disappearance put us all in a bad place. We weren't supposed to be hanging out here. If he didn't come back, we were going to have to go to our parents or the police, and neither of those choices were going to be easy. When Tom still didn't emerge for 6 hours, we went directly to the police. Maybe we should have gone to our parents first in hindsight, because when the cops called our parents out of the blue, the situation got even worse. I got chewed out in front of all the cops and all the other parents as well. While the chewing out was quite bad, what happened when the cops went to the hospital to look for Tom was much worse. They searched the entirety of the property. The basement, the rooms, the hallways, everything. There was not a single trace of Tom or anybody else. The police figured he must have just exited the building somewhere else and left us waiting on the outside for him, although Tom still hadn't returned home yet. The police told his parents he was probably just playing out this prank, but Tom didn't return that night. nor did he return the next day. He didn't return the next week. Search parties looked for him throughout the town, but he wasn't there. The hospital was searched more than once, and nothing was found. No Tom, no Lucky, no indication other than the window that Tom broke that anybody had ever been there at all. Posters with Tom's picture were put up in the post office and in stores, but he never showed up. This happened in the 70s, and to this day I have no idea what happened that night. Tom was never found. The guilt I've felt throughout the years is pretty bad, but not nearly as bad as the wondering. I never saw Tom again. I don't know what happened to him when he went into that abandoned hospital. I recently ran into an old coworker from our time we worked at a sandwich shop in the truck stop. We chatted for a while before he had to leave, but I started thinking about my stint at that place, specifically the creepy sandwich guy. In college, I worked some overnights at that truck stop. It was a pretty safe place in a smaller town, and there had only been 3 incidents in the 4 years the place had been open before I got hired. 1, a trucker got robbed. 1, a group of ladies arrested for servicing the truckers, and 1 overdose. I was never really worried, even though my coworker seemed a little bit concerned that I was a young girl working overnights. Especially at a truck stop in particular, where there was only 1 other employee in the entire place. Usually it was really slow though. Most of the time I'd simply get 3 or 4 truckers coming in within the first hour. A couple of people would come in with the munchies and order 3 dozen cookies at one time, but usually it was around 1 person an hour if that. And that meant most of the time I'd spend about 3 hours cleaning ovens, finishing dishes, deep cleaning the lobby, that sort of miscellaneous thing. I'd spend whatever leftover time in between the customers coming doing my homework. The overnight boss on the other side, the gas station side, was pretty cool as long as everything was cleaned and temped regularly. A few weeks before I inevitably left this place behind, a guy came in about 20 minutes before my shift was set to end. It was around 5 a.m. at this point. My coworker had arrived earlier, so we could fill out some paperwork he had to get done soon. He was sitting in the back office already because of this. I started to make this particular customer sandwich, making a bit of small chit-chat like usual. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He told me he was driving from New York to Wisconsin and asked me a bit about how my night had been. Nothing crazy so far. I wrapped up his sub, rang it up for him, and even threw in a small discount for him since he seemed nice. I was just happy I was getting ready to go home for a few hours of sleep before I had to head off to a long day of college classes. When I went to take his change is when things went wrong. He dropped the coins in my hand, but suddenly he grabbed my wrist tight. The next thing I knew, I was flipping over the side of the counter onto the floor. He had yanked me across and still had a firm grip on my wrist. He began to wrap his hands around my throat. Thank God my coworker was there. The manager on the other side had slipped into the bathroom, so to this guy's knowledge, I was the only person there at the moment. My coworker, while filling out his papers, happened to look up at the cameras and see the man attacking me. He was bolting out of the back just seconds after I hit the ground, and before I knew what was going on, he had chased the man outside. He didn't pursue him far, afraid that someone else might be nearby who would come after me as well. He ran back inside, locked the door to our side of the store, and shouted for the manager to call the police. The cops came. They searched the area and watched the security photos, but nothing ever came from it. The guy disappeared completely, and I never heard anything about him. I put in my 2 weeks' notice the following day, after my nerves had calmed down a bit. I was switched around so I worked during the day around my classes for my last few days. They made it a policy as well that 2 people were to be working both sides of the truck stop on overnights from that point on. I still live about half an hour from there, and honestly, I haven't gone back since that last day. That memory is still fresh in my mind, even 8 years later. So this happened about a year ago, and it's still pretty freaky. For context, my friend and I are both 22 and female. My friend Anna and I were bored one weekend and decided to go to a popular beach to take some pictures and just mess around together. We took pictures and had a pretty lovely day overall. On the way back though, we were starving, so we decided to stop at a McDonald's in the beach town. This town is really famous and nice. Lots of celebrities live there, and it's quite scenic. There's also a super famous restaurant right off the highway on the beach that's known for rich people going. The McDonald's was directly across the street from that restaurant. Since so many famous people went to this restaurant, and it was on a pretty busy road already, most of them had drivers that took them there, usually in big black Escalades. The drivers would hang out in the parking lot of that McDonald's, while their bosses ate across the street. Anna and I didn't really know this at the time. We just wanted a McFlurry. We go to the McDonald's, and right when we get out of the car, she starts acting really weird. She triple checks the car doors are locked and grabs her fancy camera to bring inside with her. When I ask her what's up, she said there's a group of drivers standing in front of the McDonald's smoking and staring at us, and it was making her feel weird. I'm a pretty chill and trusting person, so I didn't really think that much of it. It's a busy place and a super nice town after all. Not particularly worried. We go in, and there are a few other people in there about our age. We grab our food and sit at the table to eat. One of the drivers comes in and sits a few booths down with his back to the wall, right where he can see us. My back was to him, but Anna was getting really creeped out and wanted to leave. He didn't eat or order anything. He just sat there staring at us. Still though, like I said, this was a really crowded McDonald's in one of the nicest towns in Southern California, so I was feeling pretty safe. Living in South Central, you get used to the occasional creep. Still, Anna was freaked out, so I agreed to go. I had to run to the bathroom first though. It was one of those McDonald's where the counter and main dining room were one big room. Then there was a sort of hallway off to the side of the counter with more seating, and a bathroom at the very end way in the back. There was also a door going outside right next to the bathrooms. The bathroom had only 2 stalls inside. I walked into the first one, not really paying attention to whether or not anyone else was in there. So I'm in there doing my thing, when I hear the door open and I hear Anna call my name. At this point, I was very confused, since she was supposed to be watching our things. "Yeah? What's up?" She calls out to me. "Are you okay in there?" "Yeah, I'm just using the bathroom," I reply. She stood there in the doorway. After a second, I heard her leave, and I thought that was very weird. I walk out of the bathroom, only to see her waiting by the door with all of our stuff in her hands. I asked her what was going on and why she'd come into the bathroom. She looked at me extremely panicked and said we needed to leave right now. I was really confused at this point. We rushed out to the car and she started to explain what had happened. Turns out when I'd walked into the bathroom, that driver had followed me inside. I didn't remember hearing him come in. I just assumed someone had either been in the stall next to me already and was leaving, or had just come in to check their makeup or something. Honestly, I wasn't paying that much attention. He didn't close the stall door when he came in, so I wasn't aware he was still in the stall next to me. She had been on her phone, so she hadn't seen him follow me either. A young guy eating had noticed it and gone up to my friend asking if we knew the man. Frantic, she told him we did not and ran to check on me. He was hiding in the stall next to mine, with the stall door wide open, trying to peek underneath and not making a single sound. She came in and didn't see him at first, so she called my name to make sure I was okay. When the man realized someone else was now in there, he rushed out of the stall past her and disappeared. She was in shock and didn't know what to do other than grab our things and prepare to run. When we went to her car, the man was sitting in his big black car with tinted windows, parked right next to us, staring at our car. We sped off. When I got the full story, we called the McDonald's to let them know what happened. They didn't really care, of course. Then we called the non-emergency sheriff line to report it as well, which happened to be closed. Thank you, Malibu, for nothing. Eventually, my mom went full mama bear and threatened to blast it all over social media that they didn't take my report seriously. And we got a hold of someone at corporate from there on. They checked their cameras and saw the guy follow me in as well. A police report was made, so at least hopefully this thing never happens to anyone else again. I was around 16 years old when this happened to me. It was just me and my dad at our house, and since he was a businessman that traveled quite frequently, I was left home alone quite often. First of all, I'll do my best to describe to you the layout of my house so you can better understand the situation. It's a fairly small place, since it was just my father, my dog, and I living in there. There was a long hallway full of full-sized windows, separating my dad's room and mine. Our dog loved to look out of them, so we always kept them open enough for her to glance out of. I was in the last room at the end of the hallway. In between the two rooms was my bathroom and a spare room. Let's get right into it then. It was around 11 p.m. or so when the worst night of my life began. My dad was passed out in bed after a really long day of work, and I was mindlessly dancing around my house getting ready for bed. I hopped into the shower, not knowing what was coming ahead. Of course, like a cringe-worthy horror movie, my dog suddenly started aggressively barking up a storm. I decided, of course, to go out and explore by myself. I headed to my room to throw some clothes on first, though, while my dog was still shitting bricks. Months before, I'm not exactly sure how, I'd somehow managed to break my door handle. You didn't have to twist the knob to open it anymore. All it needed was a gentle push. I was scared shitless when, after just having managed to put a shirt on, my dog opened the door theirself. I looked to see her in my room, while in the midst of barking. That's when I looked out and saw it. There was only one window that had vision to the opening of my room. Just in the corner, I could see a person's face peeking in. Their face was so sinister, I can still see it in my mind years later. It was dark, so it took me a second to comprehend what I was seeing. When I finally realized, I screamed. My dad owned some guns, so when he heard me screaming, he ran out with his pistol loaded. He asked me what had happened, and I could barely mutter what I'd just seen. He ran outside to see if the man was still waiting around. We stood out there for a minute, scanning the area. All of a sudden, a man was casually strolling towards us from the opposite direction, about 100 yards away. I knew it was that very same man. I got that feeling in my stomach that you can never mistake. It was like he was trying to be so casual to cover up he had been there by coming from a different direction. They couldn't fool us, though. "You better stay the fuck away from my daughter. You see what I have here? You know what this does?" He held up his gun. I could have sworn my dad was just going to shoot the man. The strange man brushed off these threats quite easily, though, and didn't seem very bothered. "Fuck off, old man," he said, placing his hand in his pocket. My dad and I rushed back inside. The guy eventually went away, and it was almost like nothing had ever happened, but I still couldn't sleep a wink. I kept on thinking he was going to come back and hurt me because of those threats we'd made. We called the cops the next morning. They came and scoped out our house. The officer looked around trying to calm me down, but I was still pretty shaken up. He went out to the front yard, and that's when he noticed. In front of the windows in the long hallway, there were some small bushes, nothing much really. The cop from outside went to the window that had a view of where my room was. He tried to tell me the news without making me more upset, but he failed. There were indents in the dirt right in front of the window. That meant the guy knew exactly where he needed to look to see me. It seemed he had been there more than once as well, because there were various broken pieces of bush and divots in the ground. It turns out the guy was the nephew of my old neighbor. He had been staying there for months. Never arrested, never got in any trouble, barely got a slap on the wrist in the end. But at least he never bothered me after. How long had he been watching me exactly? I'll never know, really. All I do know is I keep my door shut, and I never keep the blinds open now. Like everyone else who had just graduated high school and partied throughout their last high school vacation, I was very excited to start my first day of college. I wanted to experience the entire event in sort of a typical traditional way. It was a 2-day drive to get to school, and I thought I would pack up all my belongings in my beater of a car and take the trip to school all alone. Enjoy some of the countryside while I was out driving. At the beginning, everything was fine. I started out in the morning and got a lot of driving done while sitting there with the top down in my car, listening to my music. Bad luck soon found its way into my plans, though, about an hour or so before nightfall. Whilst in the middle of driving, out of nowhere my car just suddenly shut off altogether. The dash lights came on and the steering wheel seized up completely. I was barely able to guide the car off to the side of the road, but fortunately I did make it. Unfortunately, I was now pretty screwed at this point. I'd been taking winding back roads, not highways, because I wanted to enjoy the countryside. I had driven past quite a lot of farms, but when my car died on me, I was smack dab in the middle of a long stretch of nothing but cornfields. I tried my cell phone, of course, but I was completely unable to get any signal. I didn't have any tools on me either, and I don't think it would have done me much good even if I had. I didn't know the first thing about working on cars. I considered taking a walk trying to get to a farmhouse, but I wasn't really keen on that idea. I didn't like leaving my car alone with all my worldly belongings in it, especially as I had already put the top down and I was not going to be able to put it back up. I couldn't even get the car's lights to turn on at this point. My only real option was to sit, wait in the car, and hope I could flag down someone to help me. Needless to say, though, there was very little traffic on this road. With the sun now setting, it seemed like the already scarce amount of cars was about to become even scarcer. It wasn't until well into the night that an old pickup truck came tumbling down the road, with 2 guys sitting in it. I didn't even have to flag them down. They took notice of me right away and pulled the truck over right in front of my car. The driver got out, but the passenger remained seated. I guess I thought the driver looked pretty creepy. He looked a lot like someone you'd expect to see out in the country in a horror movie. Lots of missing teeth, very dirty clothes. However, I was not about to judge the only person who'd been willing to stop and help me. The man asked me what was wrong, and I told him I really didn't know enough about cars to have any idea what was wrong. I explained to him what had happened, and that I didn't have any tools on me. I told him I was a freshman in college, and really needed to get my car fixed so I could get to school. The man walked over to his pickup truck, and pulled out what looked to be a tire iron. I was confused at first, and called out to him, telling him there was nothing wrong with my tires. I quickly discovered that he did not care. The man swiftly came at me, tire iron raised to strike. I didn't have much time to try and protect myself, and doubted I could have if I wanted to. This guy was a lot bigger than me. I did get my arm up quick enough to make a feeble attempt at catching his arm on the downswing, but it did me very little good. It may have softened the blow, but it was still more than enough of a hit to send me tumbling to the ground, and for the entire world to go black. If you've never been knocked out before, I can't really begin to explain to you what it feels like. It's all black, of course, but it's almost like you're aware and unaware of what's going on at the same time. I wasn't sure how long after the hit that I came to, but it was still dark when I opened my eyes. My head was throbbing in a way it never had before or since. I tried to move, only to realize I was now stuck in an enclosed space. It took me a few moments to realize they must have stuck me in the trunk of a car, and if I could fit in the trunk, it meant they had taken my belongings with them. I can't even tell you how long I laid there. I banged on the trunk trying to force it open, but I couldn't. It was the most terrifying time of my life. I had no idea if anyone would stop to try and help me, if I would be stuck there all night or what. I had no idea how serious the blow to my head was either. Whenever I had the strength, I would pound on the trunk in an attempt to get myself out. Finally, after what had to be hours of hell, a local police officer stopped to check out this mysterious car sitting on the side of the road. I heard him outside, so I began banging on the trunk again. I guess the asshole that attacked me had left the keys in the car, so the officer quickly got me out. It was then that I saw they had taken everything of mine. They had cleaned out my trunk and taken everything from the back seat of my car as well, even my clothes. Of course, that was the least of my worries, as the officer had to call an ambulance for me. Fortunately, I was not that seriously injured. I did eventually get to school, but I got there very late. My parents were kind enough to forward me money to buy some new clothes and other things, and I was happy that the experience didn't sour me on school altogether. For future drives, though, I think I'll just take the highway. Even though I was really looking forward to college from my freshman year, and I was excited about living in the dorms, the one thing I was not too excited about were the rules my school had regarding freshman housing. All freshmen had to have either a double or a triple room. We had to have a dorm mate, and we were not allowed to pick our dorm mate either. A few of my friends from high school were going to the same school, and I'd really wanted a room with one of them. But no, I was matched up with a guy named Colin. Still though, I tried to remain positive about my experience. I had been looking forward to going to school for a long time. Meeting Colin though, it really did heighten my disappointment. He was really weird and very dark as well, and I don't mean in like a goth sort of way or something like that. Colin was dark. He was morose. He looked like someone who'd never gone outside before ever. He was extremely pale, uneven facial hair. Even though it was hot as hell outside, he always wore this ratty dark blue hoodie, with the hood pulled up all the way over his face. He even slept in it every day. In fact, I don't think I ever saw him take it off once, and the times I saw him sleep at all were very few. I guess he had to have slept sometimes, but it definitely wasn't ever when I was trying to sleep. He had a book lamp over his bed and would spend the entire night reading. His eyes were always extremely bloodshot, and I began to wonder if he was on some sort of drugs or something. He really gave me the creeps. The worst thing about Colin, however, was the way he never said much of anything to me at all. He barely acknowledged me. It was like I didn't even exist. When I'd first met him, I got a half nod and a hey when I introduced myself. But even though Colin was weird and standoffish, I tried my best to be just fine with him. He was never mean to me exactly. For the first couple of months of living together, it was never tense either. He just did his own thing and I did mine. It began to get extremely weird though. One night when I was sleeping, I was suddenly woke up by Colin screaming at someone. Then I heard the unmistakable sounds of someone being beat over and over again. I opened my eyes but didn't get up yet. I was surprised at first that Colin seemed to have brought someone into the room while I was sleeping, but it turned out he actually hadn't. Colin was standing in the center of the room, punching himself in the face over and over again. I was actually a little bit scared, so I pretended to be asleep. He didn't carry on beating himself for very long, and soon the room was quiet. He continued to stand there at the center though, not moving. After a very long time, I finally fell back asleep. At first, I was definitely frightened. I even considered going to the housing department and letting them know what happened, demanding I be transferred to a different room. It was actually one of my buddies that convinced me not to, though. He told me he'd personally had moments of frustration with his own life and the world, and he'd punched himself before too. Didn't do it regularly or anything, but it was definitely a thing other people did sometimes. What convinced me to overlook it, though, was when he said at least he was taking out his frustrations on himself and not someone else. At the time, my friend's words made sense to me, but looking back, they really shouldn't have. Afterwards, Colin didn't end up beating himself again or anything like that. He went back to being his weird, solemn self. About a week before Thanksgiving break was coming up, though, I was woken up again by a loud noise coming from Colin's bed. This time, it was not a yell or a punching sound. It was like a suppressed exclamation of pain. Although I'd woken up, my head was still under the blanket, so I couldn't see what he was doing. I opened my eyes and peered out from a corner of the blanket, only to see the most terrifying sight I had ever seen in my life. Colin was standing on his bed, completely naked, coated in blood, and slicing himself open with what looked like a serrated knife. The shock caused me to jump out of bed and ask him what the hell he was doing. Colin stared at me, his eyes bulging wide. He dropped the knife on the blood-stained bedsheets. He held out his hands and extended his fingers like he was trying to grab something out of the air over and over. I had never been so scared in my life. I immediately ran down the hall to the RA's room and started pounding on her door. She got up and I explained what was wrong. She called campus security and an ambulance. She then told me to show her to my room. When we got back, Colin was on the bed, covered in blood and wounds. It was such a sickly sight I can barely even begin to describe it. The campus police got there quickly and tried to tend to Colin, while keeping the RA and I in the hall asking us questions. Colin was taken to the hospital. I never saw him again. Of course, I don't know what was wrong with him either. Looking back, it seems he may have had some sort of borderline personality disorder. Housing let me take my things out of my room the following day, and they upgraded me to a single room due to my experience. Colin didn't appear to school again. I know that because the RA had us all sign him a card. I hope he's okay. I hope Colin was able to take care of the problems he had and go back to school somewhere. I feel bad about the experience. Maybe if I'd told the RA about Colin punching himself, they would have known something was wrong sooner and tried to get him some kind of help. I don't know. My scary college experience isn't something that happened to me. It wasn't an experience that happened to anyone I know, but it happened on my college campus while I was going to school there. Like other stories I've told that happened to me, this story is not for any sympathy, so please don't feel sorry for me. I tell it because I love my school, and I think it's important we never forget these things when they happen. It was a very cold day in February. It was on a Thursday, I believe. On Tuesdays and Thursdays during the semester, I only had classes at night, child psychology at 7 p.m., and as I remember, I had a paper due for that class soon. Although I had my own dorm room, I also had a television in that dorm room. I knew that as long as I had the game show network, I was not going to get any of my work done. I grabbed my laptop and went to find a quiet nook in the honors lounge of my dormitory. Mainly, I was working on my citations. I was using the online database of psychology journal articles to work on my paper, so I would look at the article information, switch over to Microsoft Word, type in the information, and then go back. Well, at around 3 p.m., just as I'd finished citing an article, I went to pull up a second article from the database. It was then that a very frightening thing happened. Over the library database page, a red warning notice appeared on the screen. The notice read this: "There's been a report of a gunman on campus. Get to a safe area and take precautions until given the all clear. Avoid King's Commons and all buildings in that area." Needless to say, I was scared. I unplugged my laptop, ran up the 4 flights of stairs, and locked myself in my dorm room for what was likely the next half hour. It seemed like an eternity. I kept refreshing the homepage of my school's website, hoping to get some sort of update as to what was going on. It was finally at some time after 3:30 that the message was updated. The shooter had been killed, but it still instructed everyone to stay in their rooms until further notice. Unfortunately, as the details came in, we learned that a graduate student from another college came to our school, entered a lecture hall, and shot 26 students, killing 5 of them before killing himself. I checked my Facebook page that day. There were tons of my friends posting messages to me asking if I was okay. I had to confirm that I'd not been involved with the event whatsoever. We of course held memorials for the students who were involved and made a pledge to never forget what happened on February 14th, 2008 at Northern Illinois University. I'm definitely a workaholic. I'm one of those sorts of guys who very often stays at the office hours past when I'm scheduled. When I'm on the way home, it's usually very dark outside because of this, and there's little to no traffic as well. I tend to arrive home, eat something really quickly, and slip right into bed. Then the next morning I start the pattern all over again. I live alone, so it really isn't a problem though. I don't have a wife or a girlfriend or even a dog waiting for me at home, so it's not like there's anyone to complain. I do have my own house though. It's a beautiful townhouse in a really upscale neighborhood in the city. Anyway, the night this story happened, I was working really late at night. I'd gotten myself particularly invested in this project and was completely losing track of time. I was hit with a sudden sleepiness and emitted a long yawn. When I looked up at the clock, I noticed it was now past midnight. I was mildly shocked because although I did often stay really late at work, this was nearly 7 hours after quitting time. I decided to put my work away and get my ass home. Driving home was rather dangerous actually. I'd worked so hard that I was completely exhausted and it was difficult to even keep my eyes open. It was really cold outside as well. I went ahead and rolled my window down in the hopes that the cold wind would help me stay awake. When I got to my house, I rushed in all tuckered out. Normally, I would take a shower before bed and get into my pajamas, but I didn't even have that in me. I kicked my clothes off and threw them on the couch. Didn't even turn on any of the lights in the house. My eyes were so heavy, I figured it would just hurt my eyes to do so. I trudged through, up the stairs, and made it to my bedroom. I swear at this point my eyes were just completely closed. I couldn't even open them a little bit. I flopped down on my queen-size bed and didn't even bother covering myself up. I began to doze off quickly, but something strange happened. Out of nowhere, my bed shook a bit. At first, my mind dismissed it as some sort of sleep consciousness thing, but then I felt my bed shake again, and I began to hear a shuffling noise as well. Although I had been struggling to stay awake for a while, I snapped awake at this point. Looking towards the other side of my bed, I could see a dark figure standing between my bed and the far wall. At that point, I was completely awake. I screamed a bit and jumped up, sort of like when you see a scary bug or a snake and you have to jump away. I bumped into my nightstand. I reached out and grabbed my lamp. It was one of those touch lamps. When the light came on, I saw who had been in my bed. An old, dirty-looking man was standing in my room. He had stripped himself down to his filthy underwear and must have been sleeping right next to me. I was simultaneously disgusted and scared at the same time. I wasn't sure what to do. I grabbed my lamp and turned it off. The man tried running around the bed to get out of the room, I guess. I should have let him go probably, but I just couldn't do so. I threw the damn lamp at him, hitting him and knocking him over. I then ran out of my room, down the stairs, grabbed my phone and called 911. The police came and grabbed the man. He had broken into my house through the back door, it seemed. It was so cold out that night, he just couldn't take it outside. He'd broken in just a couple of hours before I came home. I guess he figured that since it was so late at night and nobody was there, he wouldn't be expecting anyone to come home that night. He broke my back door open, ate my food, stripped down, and went to sleep in my bed. I would have noticed this earlier had I not been so sleepy from working that night. This is a story that happened when I was in the hospital about 15 years ago. Well, I wasn't in the hospital myself. I was at the hospital a lot though, visiting my boyfriend. Yes, I am gay, and this is very important to the story. I'm sure it had a lot to do with what happened. My boyfriend at the time had been in a head-on collision. I'll never forget when I heard about it. My body went numb, and I even blacked out for a moment. Seeing him in the ICU in a coma was just so bizarre. It was almost like he wasn't even my boyfriend. Like whatever made him Jamie was just gone. I'm not even sure if I'm explaining it correctly. It was just so odd to see him like this. I was allowed to spend time with him in the ICU because I was his medical proxy. His family was severely homophobic, and we worried that something like this might happen. He knew his family would never let me in to see him, so he'd filled out the paperwork and our attorney filed it. It was established that I had full control over the situation. I, in fact, could even keep his family from seeing him if I wanted to. I'm not that kind of person, though, so his family was free to visit as often as they wanted, as long as I was made aware of the situation. My control over the matter did not sit well with his mom, of course. Jamie and his mom had never gotten along anyway. She would raise hell with the doctors about how Jamie was her son, and I was just the slur boyfriend. Yes, she used the term. I was not a true member of the family. They had better get her consent, not mine. Update her first on everything. At first, this was barely an inconvenience. I was willing to put up with it. I thought Jamie would have liked his mom to be there. Eventually, though, the doctors told me that her fighting with them so much, in front of Jamie no less, was a huge distraction to them, and the stress was affecting Jamie negatively. I tried to talk to her, but there's no talking to that woman. I tried to be nice and let her know I wanted her to be able to see her son. He had signed me in as his medical proxy. I was legally in control of the situation, and that was not going to change no matter how much she complained. She needed to quit arguing with the doctors and let them do their job. Oh yeah? Well, why don't you just get AIDS and die, you stupid... Jamie's mom sneered at me and called me a slur. That was it. I had been patient. I had been nice way beyond the expectations of anyone who would have been in my situation. I had her removed immediately. It was terrible. She yelled and screamed and called me and the doctors all sorts of slurs. Carried on about how I was going to hell, converting her son and making him into a... She was removed by security, actually the police. 2 nights later, I was leaving the hospital, heading for the hotel I was staying at. All of a sudden, I noticed some guy who had been sitting on the couch in the waiting area almost all day get up to follow me. He was big and dressed all in camouflage. He walked out behind me and into the parking garage. I was worried it might be a friend of Jamie's mom. I was confident, though, he would at least not try to do anything to me in the hospital. There were cameras and police officers all around, after all. I made it to my car and got in. Didn't take long at all before a pickup truck pulled up behind me as I was leaving the garage. Not only was it sitting awfully high, but the truck had its high beams on too. Annoying as hell. I left the parking garage and turned left. The truck followed me. At first, I thought it was nothing to worry about. You had to turn left or right anyway, so it was a 50-50 chance. When I made it to a red light, I flipped on my turn signal. Immediately, the truck turned on the same signal. I tried to put it out of my head until the exact same thing happened the next light, and again, and again. I debated back and forth in my head whether this was just being made up or if this guy was really following me. I turned on my right signal when I was supposed to make a left turn. The truck turned on their signal as well. I turned left instead, though. The truck switched their signals and followed me. No doubt they were tailing me. I made a turn I didn't have to make, and they still turned with me. In fact, I went in a complete circle and they followed me the whole way. I was terrified. I didn't even live in this city. Jamie had been airlifted there, and that's why I was staying in a hotel. I didn't know anyone other than the people in the hospital. I also didn't know where the police station was. I had no idea what to do but to keep driving. It was very late, past midnight, so there were not a lot of places or parking lots I could pull into where I could get help. I mean, there were lots, but they were all empty. None of that mattered, though. When I was feeling most frantic, I came to another red light and stopped. The truck, instead of stopping, ran right into me. My car died immediately. I was startled and scared out of my mind. I'd been wearing my seatbelt, thankfully, and hadn't been injured. The pickup wasn't hurt as badly as my now stalled car. Thankfully for me, the fucker just drove off, though. I figure what happened is Jamie's mom must have had this guy ram into me in the hopes I would be hospitalized or something. Then she could control her son's medical situation. Maybe that's why the guy waited for me and followed me for so long, getting up the nerve to actually do it. Maybe he was going to attack me, but decided I wasn't going to get out of the car and figured ramming me was a good idea. Well, it wasn't for him. The man was caught. It was Jamie's mom's cousin, of course. He went to jail for a hit and run, as I couldn't prove it was premeditated. Yes, he had been following me, but I had no evidence. His mother swore up and down that she had nothing to do with it, but nobody believed her. Jamie cut her out of his life completely when he recovered. It's been 15 years and we haven't heard from her at all. It was Jamie's decision, not mine, and we're still happily together today. My wife and I have a really unique setup in our house. My wife is a strict vegetarian, you see, but I wouldn't give up meat to save my life. She also really doesn't drink, and I'd like to have some beer every day personally. When I get home from work, she's so strict about this that she actually worries about our food and stuff getting mixed together. It's sort of obsessive-compulsive, I guess. So, in order to not have her worrying about it, I let her use the kitchen refrigerator for her food and bought a second, smaller refrigerator for my food and beer. I kept this one out in the garage. I know, it must seem sort of weird for a husband and wife to have their food completely separate from one another, but I never really thought about it that much. We didn't often have meals together. Rather, we just eat whenever we felt like it, really. For my wife, at least, it was much less of a social thing than it was simply a necessity. Plus, I like to eat much later into the night, and she wouldn't touch a single thing after 7 p.m. For most nights, I got used to going over to the garage door and didn't even bother turning the light on. I had to use the hallway light to see my way over to the refrigerator, open it up, quickly grab what I wanted, and then rush back into the house. I would do this over and over. I didn't actually use the two-car garage for much of anything else. My wife and I parked our cars in the driveway mostly. I did have 2 old motorcycles that I didn't really use anymore and a broken-down Ford Mustang, along with some old boxes stored in there though. One night, my wife had already had her food, and she decided to go to bed pretty early. It was about 10 o'clock when I realized I really hadn't had anything to eat. Again, this was not too out of the ordinary. Since my wife and I didn't really eat together, I'd often forget to eat until it was really late at night. I'd been watching some scary movies on Netflix since my wife was in bed. She didn't like that type of stuff. I got up and went over to the garage door, opened it, and went to grab some food. I can't quite explain it well, but for some reason, all of a sudden I felt very uneasy as I entered the garage. I had never felt that way before, but it was a very overwhelming, scared feeling. I chalked it up to the fact that maybe the movie I was watching was scarier than I'd initially thought it was. I quickly grabbed what I wanted, slammed the door shut, and made my way back into the home. I fixed myself the food, climbed into my chair, and started to watch my movie again. When it was over, I wasn't really that tired yet though. I was enjoying myself as well, so I decided to go ahead and pop another one in. First, though, I needed to grab myself a couple of beers with which to enhance my enjoyment of this upcoming film. On my way over to the garage, though, I began to remember my apprehension from before. It was odd because I watch these sorts of things all the time. I usually watch them alone as well. It had been years since I'd actually gotten freaked out by one. I tried to be bold and just go about my business as usual. When I got to the garage door, I tried to psych myself up. I told myself I was not going to chicken out. I opened the door, left it open, and cautiously made my way over to the refrigerator. While I was holding the door open, though, I began to get extremely freaked out again. I couldn't quite explain why. I felt so timid at the time. I was hyper-aware of what was going on around me. I got worked up, thinking someone must be in the garage with me. Surely it was just the movie making me scared, though. It was worse when the garage door to the house slowly shut behind me. Rather than grab my beer, I jogged over to the door and quickly flipped on the garage light. The garage lights were extremely bright, and since I never used them, they immediately hurt my eyes in the darkness. I groaned, and simultaneously, I heard another groan. I rubbed my eyes quickly and looked over at the far side of the garage. I couldn't see anything, and at first I thought it must be my imagination. I walked over and looked around. I looked behind the boxes, behind the car. I didn't see anyone. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, but once I turned around, I happened to glance into the back seat of the Mustang. I jumped in place when I saw someone lying in the back seat of the car, crouched down and trying to avoid being seen. This time I sprinted over to the door. I rushed into the house, slammed it behind me, and locked the door shut. The garage door opener was inside the home, so whoever was in there could not get out now. I called the police. They came and got the guy out. They found a box cutter and a razor blade on him, but that's not the scariest part. The part that got me the worst was that the man had apparently broken into my garage 2 months beforehand. He had been living in there the entire time, surviving off food from my refrigerator. Every single night I had walked into the garage without turning the light on, the man had been in there with me. That has been hard to get over. There's nothing worse than taking a wrong turn. Well, let me rephrase that quickly. There's nothing worse than taking a turn deliberately, only to realize much later on that it was the wrong turn. I was driving home from work one night. I always get bored to death going the same way over and over again, so occasionally, just to keep my mind focused, I try to take a new road and find my way home. I live in a pretty rural area too, so sometimes this can get me pretty lost. This time was definitely one of those. For people who haven't ever really lived out in the country, you might not know how positively frightening it can be to drive down an old dirt road through the hills with no streetlights, surrounded on all sides by trees in the dark. You can't drive particularly fast either, because there are plenty of sharp turns. The road I turned down that night in question had another problem as well. After a very short time on it, it quickly narrowed down to only a single lane. This made the ride even more difficult because it gave me only 2 options: drive in reverse and get back to the road I'd been driving on, or drive forward and eventually turn around in whatever driveway this road led to. I wish I could explain this in a way that truly conveyed how frightening it was. It was pitch black. My headlights only lit up a small portion of the area in front of me. Everything only slightly up ahead was completely dark, and everything behind me and to the side was pitch black. I had to drive extremely slowly for fear of running into something dangerous. After much driving, the road took a sudden turn, and my worst fear became true. This did not lead to a driveway. Instead, it turned right into a big solid metal barrier gate. Like I said, there wasn't a driveway behind it either. I could see there was room beyond the gate to turn my car around a bit, so completely scared out of my wits, I pulled up close to the gate. I got out and of course left my door open and walked slowly over to it. I quickly grabbed it and swung it open, then I rushed back to my car and slammed the door. It gave me just enough space to drive through. I slowly drove in, turned around, and pulled past the gate. At that point, I should have just driven off and left the barrier gate open, but I'm the sort of person who just can't do that. I mean, I'd opened the gate in the first place. I felt obligated to close it as I left. I looked behind my car just to make sure, and I could barely see anything behind me. The taillights created a small amount of light, but it was not nearly enough to be able to see what I was doing. I didn't have a flashlight either. I should have left, but instead I opened the door of my car. I thought by leaving the door open, I might get more light, yet it didn't really help. Slowly, I began to walk back to the gate. I was practically blind. I kept my hand on my car as I moved back, hoping my eyes would adjust eventually. They did adjust enough for me to see the gate, so I reached out and put my hand on it, prepared to pull it closed. No sooner than I had touched the gate, though, I heard very clearly, as if someone was right behind me speaking directly into my ear. "Get the hell out of here, now!" I didn't bother with the gate. Hell, my fight or flight kicked in for the first time in my life. I ran to the car without even having any control over my body. I jumped in, slammed and locked the door, and hit the gas. As I started driving, I was much more scared than I had even been outside the car. My mind began playing tricks on me, and I began to wonder if someone was hiding in my back seat or something. I was too scared to look, though. I kept expecting someone to jump out in front of my car at any second, but I never stopped. I kept on driving until I got back to the main road. I turned down it and took the more safe way home. Of course, by the time I arrived, I looked in the back seat. No one was waiting there, thankfully. My uncle has always told me to keep out of the hills. He said there were some really unpleasant, unsavory, and very dangerous people out there. I used to think he was full of it, but I don't think that much anymore. I definitely want this story to be anonymous, as it's easily the scariest thing and the worst thing that's ever happened to me. This happened nearly 30 years ago, and even today I've not fully come to terms with it. Right now, I'm 38 years old, but when this happened, I was about 9 or so. My mom, my older brother, and myself were out on a Saturday outing. We were going to Kmart to do some shopping for school. My brother was about 15 at the time. My mom had put some items on layaway and needed to make a payment on them. When we got there, there was a really long line at the layaway. She wasn't going to be able to come back later, as the payment was due on that same day. While we were waiting, my brother was of course getting quite antsy, as was I. He asked my mom if he could take me to go look at the toys instead. She agreed and we went off together. My brother, though, quickly lost interest in showing me the toys when he saw a few cute girls wandering around. He tried to drag me off with him, but at 9, I really had no interest in girls. Instead, he agreed to let me stay in the toy aisle. While he went off to flirt, I was looking at some He-Man toys when I noticed a man come skulking into the aisle. He stared at me the whole time, too. I didn't really think much about it at first. I figured he could be there to buy something for his kids. He was looking at the toys at the far end of the aisle, but every now and then, he'd covertly glance over to me, then go back to pretending to look at the toys. I noticed he kept creeping closer and closer to me, following that same pattern. I guess I should have been more alarmed, but I really didn't think I was in any danger. I had been by myself in the Kmart quite often before. The man slowly crept closer and closer. He would pick up a toy, look at it for a bit, then put it down and take a step closer. Once he was right beside me, he picked up a Skeletor toy, then turned to me. "Hey kid, do you have a Skeletor?" "No, I don't." He showed the toy to me. "Well, want me to buy it for you? Just come up to the registers and I'll buy it for you." I shook my head again. "No thank you, I'm supposed to wait here for my brother to come back." Don't worry about it, kid. I can buy the toy for you and get you back here before your brother even knows you're gone." Uncomfortable, I again shook my head. I really shouldn't, but thank you anyway. The guy didn't give up, however. He seemed really intent to get me to go with him. I kept wishing my brother would come back to the toy aisle, or at least that another adult would come and help me. This man would not leave me alone. It got worse. He kept inching closer and closer to me, and eventually wrapped his hand on my shoulder. My immediate impulse was to jerk away from him, but I stopped when I felt him put his arm on my back. I felt him press an object, which I assumed to be a knife, directly into the small of my back. I'm surprised I didn't piss myself right then and there. I was scared to death, and I wanted to run, but I was certain if I tried, the man would kill me with his knife. "Well, you could have at least had a toy," the man told me. "Now you're gonna come with me, and you're not gonna make a sound if you don't want this knife in your neck." The man pushed me forward, and I had to walk forward with him. It was difficult. My entire body felt fuzzy and weird. I couldn't even feel my hands or my feet. I began to cry a little bit, and this angered the man. "You better hold those tears in, or you're gonna be in some real pain." He made his point by pressing the tip of the blade, which was concealed in the sleeve of his jean jacket, further into my back. I didn't think I was going to die, at least not yet. I did think, though, that this man was surely going to take me away. I would never see my family again, and I had no idea what he would do to me before he killed me. There was no doubt in my mind that he would eventually kill me, though. I didn't want to cry because I didn't want him to hurt me, but I was so scared that I just couldn't help it. Tears began to fall down my cheeks. I was then hit from behind, and I fell hard onto the ground. I started bawling because I thought the man must have gotten pissed off at me. He must have stabbed me or something. Through the tears, though, I saw my 15-year-old brother suddenly on top of the man who had been kidnapping me, absolutely beating the shit out of him. He had tackled the man from behind and was completely pounding his face into a pulp. Some security guys rushed over shortly and pulled my brother off of the guy. He explained pretty quickly, though, that the creeper was trying to kidnap me. Security took my brother, me, and the kidnapper into their back office, and then they paged my mother. The man was arrested quickly and was eventually convicted. My brother probably saved my life, but he still got in trouble for leaving me alone to begin with. Even though my mom was pissed off at him, and I guess I should have been too, I was really just appreciative of what he'd done in the end. When I was in high school, I tended to spend a lot of time over at my best friend Tim's house. He lived on the other side of the neighborhood. After school, I would walk back to his house with him, and we would play video games all evening and well into the night. Then, when it got pretty late, I would walk back home across the neighborhood. I lived in a small town, so although there weren't really many people out late at night when I was walking, I never got too worried. It was a small town, and nothing bad ever happens in a small town, right? So, walking home at night alone was no big deal. One day in the fall, though, it became a very big deal. It normally took me about half an hour to walk from Tim's house to my own. I had to walk up through the main street of town, which was generally pretty deserted. All the stores and all the shops closed down around 5 or 6 in the evening. Occasionally, though, I would see someone while walking home. It was never anyone I was worried about, usually a teenager or an older woman, for example. But on this day, as I walked over the train tracks by the post office, I saw someone sitting in the middle of the parking lot of the post office, just sitting on the ground. He was wearing a hoodie, and I couldn't really get a good look at him. I was looking, though. I guess I looked too long, because he caught me looking at him. I quickly averted my gaze, as people often do when caught looking at someone else. I didn't think it was a big deal. I mean, that sort of thing happens all the time, right? I did begin to slightly worry a bit when the man sprang to his feet and began walking out of the parking lot and toward the sidewalk in a hurry. Fortunately, though, he was across the street from me. Unfortunately, he was staring directly at me as I walked along. Unnerved, I began to go a bit faster. As I did, though, the man across the street began to go faster as well. He was now glaring at me and keeping pace with me. At no point did he actually try to cross the street, though. He just kept pace. The road through town was quite a long one, and our semi-encounter had happened at the very beginning of the road. I actually had to walk the length of the road and then make a right turn when the road ended, but it seemed obvious that this man was either following or at least trying to follow me. I decided to take a bit of a gamble and take a left turn on an earlier road. If I did, I could walk around the block and still eventually get to where I was going. It was down a darker street than the main road, but now there was a chance I could at least lose the man. When I got to the spot where I wanted, I made a sudden turn and walked down that road. A quick glance behind me showed that the man had just continued to walk forward. I was relieved that he hadn't followed me. I didn't even mind that the road I was now on was much darker. After a bit more walking, I made it to the road I originally would have had to turn on anyway. There was no sign of the man, so I got to the sidewalk and made a turn to cross the road. Out of the corner of my eye, though, I suddenly saw the man come sprinting at me from around the side of a building. I immediately knew that he had headed me off at the path, so to speak. Unfortunately, he'd caught me by surprise. He tackled me to the ground. He didn't hit me, though. He held me to the ground and pinned me in place. He smelled revolting, and he had this insane look in his eyes. As I sat there struggling to get away, he held me down with no problem like the Hulk. Then he began to spit in my face. He began raving like a lunatic, telling me that I thought I was better than him, that I didn't know what it was like to have a rough life. He also kept calling me JJ for some reason, and talking to me like he knew who I was. I couldn't get away from this man. He was so much bigger and stronger than me. He had the leverage too, plus I was panicking. He wrapped his hand around my neck and began to strangle me. I struggled, and he began to shake me against the pavement. My head slammed into it and hit it again and again. Eventually, I lost consciousness. Next thing I knew, I was suddenly in the hospital. Apparently, I'd been found in a pool of my own blood on the sidewalk. The man who attacked me was nowhere to be found. I had a severe concussion, and my shoulder was fractured as well. All I could guess was that maybe this crazy guy thought he'd killed me or something and ran away in a hurry. I had a long recovery psychologically. Although I never saw the man again, I thought I saw him all the time. I thought I'd see him every time I went for a walk. I'd imagine seeing him looking into my bedroom window every night. I always thought he was there watching me, and each time I could have swore I really saw him. Sometimes I still see him even today.